I drove up to my mountain cabin to prepare it for the winter freeze and found my son's wife tangled up with a contractor on the very sofa I built with my own two hands. She never saw me standing outside the window. I walked away and made one single phone call. I did not call my son. I called the contractor's wife. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who thought they could play you for a fool. My name is Darren. I am 69 years old, a retired civil engineer, and a man who believes in measuring twice and cutting once. 20 years ago, I built this cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains from the ground up. Every timber and every nail represents my legacy, a quiet place meant to stand the test of time. I parked my Ford F-150 50 yards down the gravel driveway so the engine noise would not carry. The crisp autumn air bit at my cheeks as I grabbed my heavy winterization kit from the truck bed. I walked up the familiar stone path, expecting the cold emptiness of a vacant house. Instead, I saw movement through the large bay window. I stepped quietly onto the wooden porch and looked inside. Megan, my son, Jalen's wife, was inside the cabin. She was completely undressed, twisting around a white stranger on the leather sofa I had crafted 2 decades ago. Megan always played the role of the perfect high society boutique owner, constantly lecturing our family on appearances and moral standards. Now her pristine facade lay shattered on my living room floor. I did not yell. I did not bang on the glass to interrupt them. I simply lowered my heavy winterization kit to the wooden deck without making a single sound. I stepped back from the window and walked around the perimeter of the property. Anger is a useless emotion if you do not channel it into a concrete strategy. I needed hard facts before I took any action. Behind the cabin, parked carelessly over my late wife's old flower bed, sat a heavy-duty white pickup truck. The side doors bore a bold blue and silver logo reading Thorn Construction. I pulled my phone from my heavy coat pocket and snapped a clear photograph of the license plate and the commercial decal. I leaned against the cold wood of the exterior wall and opened the state's corporate registry database on my screen. 30 years working as a civil engineer taught me exactly how to track down the real owners of any contracting business. I typed in the company name and waited for the search results to load. The business registration popped up instantly. The company did not belong to the man currently defiling my living room. The primary stakeholder and sole registered owner was a woman named Valerie Thorne. The registry provided a direct contact number for the managing director. Megan had married my son Jalen 5 years ago, bringing her expensive tastes and endless demands into our lives. Jalen worked himself to the bone running a tech startup just to keep her draped in designer labels. Seeing her betray him in the very sanctuary I built for our family required a calculated response. I did not want a messy, pointless confrontation. I wanted absolute destruction. I dialed the registered phone number for Valerie Thorne and waited for the line to connect. The cold mountain wind whipped past my face, but I felt entirely insulated by my focus. I stood on the very ground I had cleared with my own sweat, watching a stranger's truck crush the soil. My son deserved the truth, but he needed it delivered in a way that left no room for his wife to spin her usual lies. The phone rang 3 times before a woman answered with a sharp professional tone. She identified herself as Valerie Thorne of Thorne Construction. I kept my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. I told her my name is Darren Mitchell, and I gave her the exact address of my cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Valerie sounded confused and asked if I was calling to request a new project estimate. I informed her that I was calling to report on the current status of her company vehicle. I told her the truck was parked illegally in my backyard. I then explained that her husband was currently inside my living room vigorously testing the structural integrity of my handcrafted leather sofa with my daughter-in-law. Silence hung heavy on the other end of the line. It was the kind of deafening silence that precedes a massive explosion. I heard a sharp intake of breath followed immediately by the sound of car keys jingling. I told Valerie she had exactly 20 minutes to arrive at the address before I walked inside and handled the situation myself. I ended the call without waiting for her reply. A man acting on raw impulse will smash a window and throw empty punches. A man who understands structural weaknesses will step back and let the foundation collapse under its own compromised weight. I had no intention of warning my son just yet. Jalen needed undeniable proof, and I was going to serve it to him on a silver platter. I turned off my phone and walked toward the dense tree line surrounding the property. The cold wind howled through the thick pine branches, but I maintained a quiet, burning focus. I leaned against a massive oak tree and watched the access road. The trap was set, and the participants were completely unaware of the incoming storm. I stood hidden among the tall pine trees, watching the gravel driveway intently. Exactly 18 minutes later, a black SUV tore up the mountain path at a reckless speed. The vehicle skidded to a halt right next to my truck, throwing dirt and gravel high into the air. A blonde woman in a sharp business suit stepped out. Valerie Thorne marched toward the front deck with the furious momentum of a woman who just had her entire world upended. She did not bother knocking. Valerie lifted her heavy boot and kicked the cabin door open with a thunderous crash. Instantly, pure chaos erupted inside the house. I heard Megan scream in sheer terror. I heard the contractor shouting frantic, useless excuses as furniture scraped violently against the hardwood floor. I waited 10 seconds to let the reality of the situation trap them completely. Then I walked out from the tree line and stepped onto the porch. I walked through the broken front door, ignoring the naked panic unfolding in my living room. Megan scrambled across the floor, desperately pulling her expensive designer clothes over her shivering body. Her face turned chalk white when she saw me standing in the doorway. The contractor tripped over the coffee table, clutching his jeans in absolute disgrace. Valerie stood over them, radiating pure, concentrated rage. I did not look at my daughter-in-law. I did not acknowledge the cheating husband. My eyes locked onto the kitchen island a few feet away. A large set of architectural blueprints lay unrolled across the granite countertop. I stepped past the shouting contractor and walked directly to the kitchen. I looked down at the detailed schematics. The infidelity was a vile betrayal, but the blueprint sitting on my counter revealed a much larger, far more dangerous crime. Valerie did not scream. Her fury was a cold, calculated force that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. She marched up to Bradley, who was desperately trying to pull his denim jeans over his pale, shaking legs. She delivered a single, resounding slap across his face. The sharp crack echoed off the heavy timber walls I had hoisted into place 20 years ago. Megan let out a pathetic whimper, crawling across the hardwood floor to gather her scattered designer clothes. She clutched a silk blouse against her chest, her carefully manicured high society image reduced to a pathetic spectacle of sheer panic. I ignored them both. My attention remained entirely fixed on the kitchen island. The heavy architectural blueprints laid out on the granite countertop demanded my full professional scrutiny. I spent 3 decades reading civil engineering schematics, calculating load bearings and stress points. My eyes instantly scanned the key structural details. These were not minor renovation plans. The bold black ink outlined a complete, ruthless demolition of my mountain cabin. The plans depicted a massive 3-story commercial retreat in its exact place, complete with luxury rental suites and a wraparound viewing deck. They planned to tear my legacy down to the foundational concrete. I traced my finger down the thick paper to the bottom right corner of the document. The authorization block required the signature of the primary property owner. The signature resting on that designated line hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was not a sloppy forgery. I recognized the sharp, arrogant loops immediately. It belonged to my own son, Jalen Mitchell. He had officially authorized the destruction of the very home his mother and I built for him. The vulgar display on my sofa was merely a symptom of a much deeper rot. Megan finally managed to pull her expensive dress over her head. She stumbled toward the kitchen island, her voice shaking uncontrollably. She tried to craft a lie on the spot, stammering frantically that Jalen and she merely wanted to surprise me with a modern update for my retirement. Her words sounded incredibly hollow, bouncing uselessly off the solid wood walls. I did not dignify her pathetic excuse with a response. I did not even look at her face. I shifted the heavy paper toward the overhead light to examine a blue ink stamp pressed near the bottom margin. It was a commercial loan application approval from Liberty Vanguard Bank. The document detailed a massive funding release tied directly to the property's appraised value. 10 years ago, shortly after my wife passed away from a sudden illness, I transferred the cabin's title into Jalen's name. I did it to spare him the crushing burden of future estate taxes. I trusted the boy I raised. I believed he understood the sacred value of the timber and stone we placed together. However, I am a man who builds bridges, and a good engineer always installs a failsafe. I executed a legally binding life estate agreement during that transfer. I retained the absolute legal right to possess, occupy, and control the property until the day I drew my last breath. Jalen had no legal authority to demolish a single wall, let alone secure a multi-million-dollar commercial bank loan against the land without my explicit written consent. Megan kept rambling, her voice pitching higher as she tried to fill the heavy silence. She claimed the blueprints were just preliminary sketches. I tuned out her desperate noise. My son was using my sanctuary as collateral for a massive corporate payout. Valerie stepped up to the kitchen island right beside me. She pulled out her smartphone and began snapping high-resolution photographs of the blueprints. She made sure to capture the bank stamps, the commercial logos, and Jalen's bold signature. She then turned her camera toward her husband. Bradley stood frozen by the stone fireplace, utterly defenseless and exposed. Valerie took a crystal-clear picture of his half-dressed, miserable state. She lowered her phone and looked him dead in the eyes. She informed him in a voice devoid of any warmth that she had already contacted their commercial bank on the long drive up the mountain. She told him every joint account, business line of credit, and corporate card bearing his name was officially frozen. She promised him he would not see another dime of the money she had earned building Thorn Construction from the ground up. Bradley tried to reach out to her, begging pathetically for a chance to explain his actions. Valerie simply turned on her heel, her boots clicking sharply against the wooden floor, and walked out the front door. Her black SUV roared to life and sped down the gravel driveway, leaving a thick cloud of dust in its wake. Bradley slumped onto the brick hearth, defeated and financially ruined in less than 5 minutes. I looked down at the damning schematics one last time. I rolled the heavy paper into a tight, perfect cylinder and tucked it securely under my right arm. I had seen enough. The cheating wife and the disgraced contractor were no longer my primary concern. They were merely the collateral damage of a much larger, more insidious scheme. I turned my back on both of them. I walked toward the doorway, carrying the undeniable proof of my own son's ultimate betrayal. Megan chased after me as I stepped out onto the cold front porch. She grabbed the sleeve of my heavy winter coat, begging me frantically not to call Jalen. She cried real tears, now terrified of losing the luxurious lifestyle she had grown so accustomed to. I yanked my arm away with enough force to send her stumbling backward against the wooden railing. I stepped off the porch and walked directly to my truck, leaving her shivering in the biting mountain wind. I climbed into the driver's seat, tossed the rolled-up blueprints onto the passenger side, and started the heavy engine. I did not look back at the cabin in my rearview mirror. The betrayal I had just witnessed fundamentally changed the entire landscape of my family. I steered the truck down the winding mountain road, my mind working quickly through the variables of this new reality. Megan's infidelity was a personal failing, but Jalen's signature on a commercial demolition order was a calculated financial assault. He was bleeding money somewhere. A man does not secretly mortgage his family legacy unless his own walls are rapidly caving in. My son ran a tech startup in the city, boasting constantly about rapid growth and securing massive venture capital. I knew I would not find the answers hiding in the quiet mountains. I merged onto the interstate, pressing my heavy work boot firmly on the gas pedal. I drove straight toward the towering city skyline, my jaw clenched tight. I was going directly to Jalen's executive office. The illusion of my perfectly successful son was over. I needed to see exactly how deep this financial rot went. The war had completely shifted. I was no longer dealing with a cheating daughter-in-law. I was hunting down a traitorous son. I parked my heavy truck 2 blocks away from the sleek glass facade of the downtown commercial district. 5 years ago, I wrote the initial seed capital check that paid for the first year of my son's commercial lease. I believed in his vision for a tech startup. I believed I was investing in his future and his independence. I walked up to the side entrance and pulled the magnetic master key fob from my wallet. Jalen gave it to me the day they opened, a gesture of respect that now felt like a profound tactical error on his part. The heavy glass door clicked open. I stepped into the dark lobby. The main bullpen was silent, filled with rows of empty ergonomic chairs and dormant monitors. I moved silently across the polished concrete floor. 30 years on active construction sites taught me how to walk without making a single sound. A sliver of sharp LED light spilled out from beneath the door of the corner executive office. I approached the frosted glass partition. Jalen was inside. He was pacing frantically behind his custom mahogany desk. His voice cut through the silence of the empty office, harsh and strained. He was not talking to a tech investor. He was begging. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the hallway. Jalen had his phone on speaker. The voice on the other end was a man cold and professional. The man stated clearly that the underwriting department required a completely clean title before releasing the $2 million. He emphasized that the commercial loan was currently stalled in legal review. My son slammed his hand against the desktop. He yelled into the speaker that the collateral was absolutely solid. He insisted the Blue Ridge Mountain property appraised for nearly $3 million. The loan officer countered immediately. He pointed out the active life estate deed attached to the property record. He told Jalen the bank would not issue commercial funds against a property occupied by an individual possessing lifetime legal rights. Jalen wiped sweat from his forehead. His voice dropped to a desperate, calculating pitch. He promised the loan officer the life estate complication would be permanently dissolved by the end of the week. He swore the property title would be completely unencumbered and ready for full collateral transfer. I listened to my own flesh and blood negotiate the sale of my home to save his failing business. He needed $2 million immediately to avoid financial ruin. The loan officer demanded a guarantee. He asked exactly how Jalen intended to remove my legally binding right to occupy the property. Jalen stopped pacing. He leaned over the desk and spoke directly into the microphone. He stated that his father was experiencing a rapid and severe cognitive decline. He claimed I was a danger to myself and no longer competent to manage my own affairs or maintain a legal residence. The absolute coldness in his voice paralyzed me. The loan officer asked for medical verification. Jalen confidently replied that the paperwork was already secured. He stated a private psychiatrist had evaluated my medical history and signed off on a preliminary involuntary psychiatric hold. He named the facility Silver Pines. It is a high-security behavioral ward on the outskirts of the county. Jalen assured the bank that the ambulance transport was scheduled for Friday morning. Once I was legally committed and declared mentally unfit by the state, my life estate rights would be instantly invalidated. Jalen would gain immediate, undisputed ownership of the mountain cabin. He was planning to lock me inside a padded room for the rest of my life just to clear a property deed. I did not kick the door open. I did not storm into the office and demand an explanation. An emotional confrontation achieves absolutely nothing against a man willing to commit his own father to an asylum. I stepped back from the frosted glass. I turned around and retraced my steps across the dark, polished concrete floor. I exited the building with the same absolute silence I used to enter. The cold night air hit my face as I walked back to my truck. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. There was no sorrow left inside my chest. Jalen and Megan were not misguided children making a desperate mistake. They were predators. They orchestrated a coordinated assault on my freedom, my property, and my sanity. I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. I analyzed their entire strategy. They required a confused, deteriorating old man to make their medical forgery believable to a judge. They needed me to act like a victim losing his grip on reality. I realized instantly that fighting their narrative directly would only make me look defensive and unstable. I decided right then to give them exactly what they wanted. I would become the precise madman they required to execute their trap. I started the engine and drove into the city traffic. I had a performance to prepare for. I sat in my wingback armchair the next morning and waited for the predators to arrive at my front door. I prepared my wardrobe with the same precision I used to draft commercial bridge schematics. I chose a heavy wool sweater and deliberately buttoned it misaligned, letting the fabric bunch awkwardly around my collar. I left my reading glasses resting crookedly on the bridge of my nose. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. Jalen and Megan walked into my living room carrying a massive, overly expensive fruit basket wrapped in clear cellophane. They wore identical masks of deep manufactured concern. Megan placed the basket on the coffee table with exaggerated gentleness, as if she were approaching a wounded animal. Jalen stood beside her, his shoulders tense, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of resistance. I stared blankly at the television screen, which was turned off. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for them. Jalen cleared his throat loudly to announce their presence. He stepped into my line of sight and asked how I was feeling today in a slow, patronizing tone reserved for toddlers. I did not blink. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly as they rested on the armrests. I knew exactly what they wanted to see. They needed visual confirmation that my mind was crumbling, that the strong father who built this family was reduced to a fragile shell. Megan stepped closer, placing a perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder. She wore the same innocent expression I had seen shattered on my cabin floor just 24 hours earlier. She asked if I had eaten breakfast, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. I tilted my head slowly, looking past her entirely. I reached out with a trembling hand and gently patted Megan's wrist. I looked her dead in the eyes and called her by my late wife's name. I told her I was glad she finally came home from the grocery store because we needed to finish painting the nursery for our boy. My wife passed away over a decade ago. Megan froze instantly. She shot a rapid, triumphant look over her shoulder at my son. Jalen's entire posture relaxed. The tension drained from his shoulders as he absorbed my deliberate act of cognitive failure. He believed the medical narrative he invented for the bank was actually manifesting right in front of him. He pulled out a leather chair from the dining table and dragged it right next to my armchair. He unclasped his designer briefcase with eager, greedy hands. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and placed them squarely on my lap. The crisp white paper felt heavy against my knees. Jalen adopted a soothing, persuasive voice. He told me I'd been working too hard for too long and that it was time to let him shoulder the burden. He spun a beautiful lie about protecting my legacy and ensuring I never had to worry about bills or maintenance ever again. I stared blankly at the text. My mind was perfectly sharp, calculating every single word printed on the page. It was not a simple estate management form. It was a comprehensive transfer of authority. The document granted complete, unrestricted control over my banking, my real estate, and my medical decisions. It was a legal weapon designed to strip me of my humanity and hand the keys to my entire kingdom over to a traitor. Jalen tapped the bottom of the page with his index finger. He claimed the document was just a standard procedure to help him manage my retirement funds so I could relax without stress. He insisted the bank required this paperwork to keep my accounts secure from potential scammers. The irony of a scammer warning me about fraud did not register on his face. Megan chimed in from the background, adding that they only wanted what was absolute best for my health and comfort. She promised they would handle all the heavy lifting from now on. I looked up at Jalen with wide, vacant eyes. I asked him if this meant I could finally stop worrying about the property taxes on the mountain cabin. Jalen smiled warmly, showing his perfectly white teeth. He promised me he would take complete care of the cabin and that I would never have to think about it again. I knew exactly how he planned to take care of it. I knew about the demolition blueprints and the commercial loan waiting for my signature. I let my chin drop slightly, mimicking the posture of a defeated, exhausted old man surrendering his independence. Jalen reached into his breast pocket and produced a sleek silver pen. He uncapped it and pressed it firmly into my right hand. He pointed to the thick black line at the bottom of the 4th page. He urged me to sign right there, promising that everything would be easier tomorrow. He needed my legal authorization to finalize the $2 million. He needed me to sign away my life so he could fund his illusions. I gripped the silver pen tightly, ready to give him exactly what he asked for. I lowered the pen to the paper. I forced my hand to shake violently, making the tip of the pen scratch unevenly against the smooth surface. I began to write my name. 30 years ago, I established my core financial trusts and legal protections with a highly specific mandate. My legal given name is Harlan Xavier Reed. On every legitimate binding document concerning my estate, the inclusion of my middle initial is an absolute legal requirement. Any signature lacking that specific letter immediately triggers a fraud alert within my primary banking institution. I deliberately skipped the middle initial. I dragged the pen across the page, forming a sloppy, uneven version of my first and last name. I intentionally altered the tail of the final letter, pulling it sharply upward instead of letting it drop. The signature looked exactly like the desperate, confused scrawl of a man losing his mind. It was completely legally invalid. Jalen did not bother to inspect the ink. He snatched the paper from my lap the second the pen lifted from the page. He shoved the documents back into his leather briefcase and snapped the locks shut. The illusion of a caring son vanished instantly. He told Megan they needed to leave immediately for an urgent meeting at the bank. They did not say goodbye. They simply walked out the front door, leaving the overpriced fruit basket sitting untouched on my coffee table. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them. I sat in the silence of my living room and straightened my posture. I unbuttoned the misaligned wool sweater and placed my reading glasses firmly on the table. The performance was over. Jalen thought he just stole my empire. In reality, he had just armed my trap. I waited until the sound of Jalen's engine faded completely down the street. The heavy wooden door remained firmly shut. I stood up from my armchair and the fake, violent tremors instantly vanished from my hands. My spine straightened, snapping back into the rigid posture of a man who commanded active construction sites for 30 years. The pathetic, confused old man my son thought he had conquered simply ceased to exist. I pulled off the mismatched wool sweater, tossed it onto the sofa, and grabbed my cell phone. I bypassed my standard contacts and dialed a secure unlisted number for Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan is a ruthless financial attorney and my oldest confidant. The line connected after a single ring. I spoke with absolute clarity, instructing him to clear his morning schedule immediately because our target had taken the bait. I grabbed my heavy coat and my truck keys, locking the front door behind me. I drove my Ford F-150 straight into the heart of the city's financial district, navigating the dense morning traffic with practiced ease. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of Hayes and Associates and took the executive elevator directly to the top floor. I walked past the reception desk with heavy, purposeful strides. The receptionist did not ask for my name. She simply nodded and buzzed me through the heavy mahogany doors leading to the corner office. Jonathan stood waiting by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. I sat down in the leather guest chair, my mind operating with cold, calculated precision. I recounted the entire morning interaction to Jonathan without a single trace of sorrow or hesitation. I detailed the fruit basket, the patronizing tone, and the thick stack of legal documents Jalen placed on my lap. I informed Jonathan that Jalen was currently driving straight to Liberty Vanguard Bank with the signed power of attorney. Jonathan leaned forward, asking if I had executed the signature exactly as we had planned a decade ago. 10 years ago, when my engineering firm was expanding rapidly, Jonathan and I anticipated the threat of corporate predators attempting hostile takeovers. We established a highly classified legal safeguard known as the duress protocol. I explained to Jonathan that I had deliberately omitted my middle initial and intentionally warped the final loop of my last name. Jonathan smiled thinly. He confirmed that my primary banking institution and the state registry held specific, unalterable instructions regarding my legal signature. Any document lacking the letter X or featuring that specific distorted tail was automatically flagged as a document signed under severe physical or psychological coercion. By taking that flawed piece of paper and attempting to utilize it at a federally insured banking institution, Jalen had just crossed a massive legal boundary. Jonathan opened a thick leather binder on his desk and pulled out the original protocol agreement. He stated that the moment Jalen handed that forged power of attorney to the loan officer, he was submitting fraudulent documents to a financial institution. This action instantly elevated the situation from a family dispute to premeditated federal wire fraud. My son was using a coerced signature across state banking lines to secure a commercial loan. It was a massive felony carrying severe mandatory prison sentences. Jalen and Megan thought they had outsmarted a dying man. Instead, they had willfully triggered a dormant legal landmine designed to obliterate corporate criminals. They were walking into a federal trap entirely of their own making. Jonathan immediately reached for his desk phone to initiate the defensive sequence. He stated he would call the fraud department at Liberty Vanguard Bank to intercept the paperwork before the ink could dry. He planned to freeze all of my personal and business accounts immediately, ensuring Jalen could not access a single penny of my actual wealth. He also intended to block the $2 million commercial loan from clearing the underwriting department. I reached across the wide oak desk and clamped my hand firmly over Jonathan's wrist, stopping him from lifting the receiver. I looked my attorney dead in the eyes and commanded him to stand down. Jonathan stared back in shock, arguing that letting the paperwork process would give Jalen temporary legal authority over the cabin and potentially expose my secondary accounts. I ignored his legal caution. I ordered him to let the forged power of attorney pass through the initial security checks. I instructed him to allow the bank to approve the commercial loan application without any interference. Jonathan argued that giving a desperate man access to $2 million of unearned capital was extremely reckless. I tightened my grip on his arm and repeated my command with absolute authority. I did not want the bank to flag the fraud today. I wanted the underwriting department to stamp the approval, release the funds, and transfer the $2 million directly into Jalen's corporate startup account. Jonathan slowly pulled his hand away from the phone, realizing the sheer magnitude of what I was proposing. I was demanding that my own attorney stand by and watch my son successfully steal the equity of my mountain cabin. I leaned back in the leather chair and calmly explained the mechanics of my strategy. I told Jonathan that if we blocked the loan today, the bank would simply reject the application. Jalen could easily hire a defense attorney to argue the flawed signature was a clerical error or a simple misunderstanding between a confused father and a helpful son. An intercepted loan is merely an attempt, a minor slap on the wrist that they could slither out of. I wanted absolute, inescapable destruction. A blocked loan is an attempt, but a spent loan is a confirmed, undeniable felony. I explained that Jalen's tech startup was currently drowning in hidden debt, and Megan was desperate to maintain her high society boutique. The moment that $2 million hit Jalen's corporate account, they would not be able to resist spending it. They would use stolen federal funds to pay off angry investors, cover commercial rent, and fund their luxurious lifestyle. The moment they transferred a single dollar of that fraudulent money to cover their personal or business debts, the crime became permanent. It would cement their guilt across multiple federal agencies. I told Jonathan we had to give them enough rope to hang themselves completely. They needed to feel the absolute thrill of victory. They needed to believe they had successfully outsmarted me and secured their future. We would let them build their entire reality on a foundation of stolen federal money. Once they spent the funds, there would be no defense lawyers clever enough to save them from federal prison. I instructed Jonathan to monitor the transaction from the shadows but take zero preventative action. The trap was locked, and I was going to watch them walk right off the edge. I sat back in the deep leather guest chair in Jonathan's corner office. The federal trap was successfully set at the bank, but I had absolutely no intention of waiting for the government machinery to initiate the consequences. I wanted Jalen and Megan to feel the ground crumble beneath their feet immediately. Jonathan turned to his heavy steel filing cabinet and unlocked the reinforced bottom drawer. He pulled out a thick black binder embossed with a subtle gold emblem and slid it across the polished mahogany desk. The premium leather cover read, Apex Holdings. 10 years ago, I formed this private commercial real estate corporation to secure stable, long-term assets for my retirement portfolio. I am the sole shareholder and the absolute owner of every brick window and steel beam under its corporate umbrella. Jalen and Megan completely bought into their own arrogant narratives. They firmly believed they had secured prime downtown real estate for his tech startup and her luxury boutique through their own brilliant business acumen and relentless networking. They boasted constantly at family dinners about negotiating cutthroat deals with invisible corporate landlords. They loved playing the role of self-made entrepreneurs conquering the city. They never once suspected that the ruthless corporate landlord they bragged about outsmarting was actually sitting across the dinner table passing them the salt. I opened the heavy black binder. The glossy pages contained the original lease agreements for both of their commercial properties. I looked at the smug, sweeping signatures they had confidently scrawled at the bottom of the contracts 5 years ago. They thought they were building independent empires. They were actually playing in a sandbox I bought and paid for. The reality of their supposed success was nothing more than an expensive illusion I maintained out of misplaced paternal love. I turned to the financial addendums attached to their original commercial leases. I stared at the precise mathematical breakdown of their monthly operating costs. For half a decade, I had secretly subsidized their corporate rent by exactly 70%. The market rate for Jalen's sprawling corner office in the tech district was $15,000 a month. He paid $4,500. Megan occupied 3,000 square feet of premium retail space in the high-end shopping pavilion. She paid barely enough to cover the standard property taxes. I absorbed the massive financial deficit every single month from my own private equity accounts. I absorbed it because I foolishly wanted my son and his wife to experience the pride of building successful enterprises without the crushing weight of initial overhead. My generosity had not fostered gratitude. It had bred absolute toxic entitlement. They took my invisible financial safety net and used the surplus cash to fund their lavish lifestyle, buying imported luxury cars and booking designer vacations while looking down on my simple mountain cabin. I closed the black binder with a sharp, decisive snap. I looked directly at Jonathan and issued my next command. I instructed him to terminate all familial subsidies on both properties effective immediately. The corporate grace period was officially over. Jonathan nodded slowly, a grim understanding settling across his sharp features. He knew exactly what this meant. I was stripping away the protective insulation that kept their businesses afloat. Jalen and Megan were about to experience the brutal, unforgiving reality of the open commercial market. I told Jonathan I wanted no warnings, no friendly phone calls, and absolutely no room for negotiation. The financial umbilical cord was completely severed. They were going to drown in their own overhead. Jonathan immediately turned to his computer terminal and pulled up the official Apex Holdings legal letterhead. His fingers flew across the keyboard with lethal efficiency. He drafted the first notice directed to Jalen's tech startup. The legal language was cold, precise, and completely devoid of any familial sentiment. The document officially revoked the discretionary landlord discount. It mandated that the monthly lease payment would immediately revert to the current market rate of $18,000, effective on the first day of the upcoming month. Jonathan then drafted an identical notice for Megan's luxury boutique, increasing her monthly financial obligation by a staggering 300%. But a simple rent hike was not enough. I needed to apply a pressure they could not possibly ignore. I instructed Jonathan to trigger the penalty clauses buried deep within page 40 of their original commercial contracts. Over the past 5 years, both Jalen and Megan had brazenly ignored standard commercial operating protocols. They executed unauthorized interior renovations, completely bypassed mandatory property tax declarations, and failed to file routine commercial usage permits, assuming their faceless landlord would simply absorb the bureaucratic fines. I had absorbed them quietly to protect their credit scores. Now, I weaponized those exact violations. Jonathan added a strict addendum to both eviction notices. He applied 5 years of compounding back taxes, municipal fines, and commercial violation penalties directly to their accounts. The total sum required for immediate payment exceeded $80,000 per property. The legal documents printed from the heavy office machine with a rhythmic, satisfying hum. Jonathan stacked the crisp white papers neatly on his desk. The financial burden was mathematically insurmountable. Jalen and Megan were officially bankrupt. They just did not know it yet. Jonathan slid the newly printed legal notices across the polished mahogany desk. He placed a heavy gold fountain pen perfectly aligned next to the documents. I leaned forward and picked up the pen. My hand did not shake. My grip was absolute. I was no longer the confused, vulnerable old man sitting in a mismatched sweater. I was the executive director of Apex Holdings reclaiming his territory. I signed my full legal name, Darren Xavier Mitchell, at the bottom of the primary lease adjustments. The ink flowed smoothly, solidifying my absolute control over their impending ruin. I then pulled the preliminary eviction warnings toward me. These documents demanded immediate compliance or forced removal within 72 hours. I signed them with a sharp, aggressive stroke. I wanted to systematically destroy their inflated pride long before the federal agents arrived to strip away their freedom. Jalen and Megan defined their entire self-worth by their material success and public perception. They looked down on my simple life because they believed they had ascended to a higher social echelon. I was tearing down that illusion with a single signature. I handed the executed documents back to Jonathan. He placed them into thick certified mail envelopes and handed them directly to his senior paralegal for immediate hand-delivered dispatch. The couriers would arrive at their respective businesses simultaneously. The financial hemorrhage had officially begun. The massive fraudulent loan they were desperately trying to process through Liberty Vanguard Bank was no longer a luxury. It was now their absolute only chance for basic survival. I had expertly backed them into a corner where they had absolutely no choice but to tap into those stolen funds and commit federal wire fraud. I stood up from the leather chair, buttoned my heavy winter coat, and walked out of the law firm. 2 uniformed couriers arrived at their respective destinations at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The first courier walked into the sleek glass lobby of Jalen's tech startup, bypassing the receptionist to hand a thick, certified envelope directly to my son. Simultaneously, the second courier entered Megan's luxury boutique across town, presenting an identical envelope to her over a glass display counter. Jalen ripped his envelope open the second his office door clicked shut. His eyes scanned the crisp legal letterhead of Apex Holdings. The color drained from his face as he read the termination of his discretionary rent subsidy. The notice demanded an immediate market rate adjustment of $18,000 per month and $80,000 in compounding back taxes for unauthorized commercial modifications. The illusion of his thriving business shattered instantly. Jalen stared at a catastrophic deficit that would force him into immediate bankruptcy. Panic replaced his usual arrogant composure. He scrambled to his desk and logged into his corporate banking portal. His startup accounts were completely drained, running on fumes and empty promises to angry venture capitalists. He needed cash immediately to stop the impending eviction and keep the lights on. The $2 million commercial loan from Liberty Vanguard Bank, secured by the fraudulent power of attorney and the stolen equity of my mountain cabin, was sitting in a pending transfer status. Jalen did not hesitate. He bypassed standard corporate protocols and authorized an immediate drawdown of $100,000. He routed the stolen federal funds directly into his primary operating account to cover the Apex Holdings penalties. His finger clicked the mouse, finalizing the transaction. He took a deep breath, believing he had just saved his empire. In reality, he had just cemented his guilt and committed irreversible federal wire fraud. Across the city, Megan stood frozen behind the marble counter of her boutique. She stared at her own eviction notice from Apex Holdings. The document demanded back taxes and a 300% rent increase. Her high society image was built entirely on a foundation of maxed-out credit cards and a refusal to acknowledge basic mathematics. For years, she had quietly exhausted a dozen high-yield credit lines just to maintain the appearance of a wealthy boutique owner stocking inventory she could never sell and hosting lavish promotional parties she could never afford. The boutique was bleeding cash daily, and this sudden massive financial demand from her corporate landlord was a fatal blow. She could not ask Jalen for help. He was already drowning in his own corporate failures, and admitting her boutique was entirely insolvent would destroy the perfect facade she meticulously curated for him and their social circle. She needed untraceable cash immediately. She locked the front door of the boutique, flipped the closed sign outward, and rushed to her private back office. She opened her laptop and pulled out a scanned copy of the financial power of attorney she and Jalen had tricked me into signing that morning. She logged into what she believed was the online portal for my primary retirement fund. The system prompted her for legal authorization. She uploaded the forged document exploiting the very system meant to protect my life savings. She viewed the massive balance in the account and felt a surge of arrogant relief. She believed she had unlimited access to the wealth I had built over 30 years on construction sites. She saw my retirement fund as her own personal emergency bailout, completely unaware that she was navigating a closely monitored, heavily restricted financial trap set directly by my attorney. Megan did not simply pay her commercial rent arrears. The eviction notice from Apex Holdings was only half of her immediate crisis. Since the disastrous confrontation at the mountain cabin, Bradley Thorne had been relentlessly calling her private cell phone. Valerie Thorne had frozen every single one of Bradley's business and personal accounts, leaving him entirely destitute. Bradley was demanding a massive payout to start a new life, implicitly threatening to expose the sordid details of their affair to Jalen and the rest of her wealthy social circle if she refused to fund his escape. Megan could not allow her pristine reputation to be dragged through the mud by a desperate, ruined contractor. She navigated the banking interface with trembling fingers, desperate to buy his permanent silence. She initiated a direct wire transfer from my monitored retirement account. She typed in the routing number for Thorne Construction, hoping to bypass Bradley's frozen personal assets by funneling the cash through his corporate entity. She authorized a transfer of exactly $50,000. The banking portal required a justification for such a significant movement of funds. Megan typed the words cabin renovation into the memo line, believing the fake description would easily mask the illicit payoff. She clicked confirm and watched the loading screen authorize the transaction. She let out a long sigh of relief, convinced she had just solved both her impending commercial eviction and her dangerous extortion problem with a single few keystrokes. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water, believing the storm had passed. She had no idea that her desperate attempt to cover her tracks had just legally bound her and her lover together in a massive, easily trackable financial crime. The money had officially moved. I sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan Hayes' private town car, watching the city skyline blur past the tinted windows. We were parked discreetly 3 blocks away from Jalen's tech startup. Jonathan sat beside me with his secure laptop open on his knees, directly linked to the encrypted monitoring software at Liberty Vanguard Bank. The screen suddenly flashed a bright, solid red. An automated high-level fraud alert pinged through the system. Jonathan tapped a few keys, isolating the exact transaction pathway. He turned the screen toward me with a grim, calculating smile. He handed me a freshly printed wire transfer record pulled directly from the bank's internal tracking server. The document detailed the exact movement of $50,000 from my heavily restricted retirement account directly into the corporate account of Thorne Construction. The memo line glaringly read cabin renovation. I stared at the printed confirmation. Megan had just bypassed the commercial loan entirely and attacked my personal assets directly using the forged power of attorney. By moving $50,000 of unearned capital across institutional lines, Megan had officially escalated her actions from mere deception to textbook grand larceny. She had weaponized my identity to silence her extramarital lover. Furthermore, by accepting stolen funds into a corporate account to fund his personal escape, Bradley Thorne was no longer just an unfaithful husband and a disgraced contractor. He was now an active, documented accomplice to the receipt and concealment of stolen federal funds. Jonathan closed his laptop with a sharp click. The trap had clamped shut perfectly. Jalen had hung himself with the commercial loan and Megan had buried herself with the wire transfer. I instructed Jonathan to put the car in drive. It was time to widen the net and bring the final player onto the battlefield. I drove out to a neon-lit diner on the edge of the county line, far away from the polished financial district and the sprawling mountain cabins. Neutral ground was absolutely essential for this meeting. I walked through the glass doors and immediately spotted Valerie Thorne sitting alone in a corner booth. She wore a sharp, dark blazer projecting the unyielding authority of a woman who commanded heavy machinery and rough men for a living. I slid into the cracked vinyl seat across from her without offering a single pleasant greeting. Pleasantries were a ridiculous waste of time for people dealing with ultimate betrayals. I reached inside the breast pocket of my heavy winter coat and withdrew the folded wire transfer record Jonathan had printed for me just hours ago. I smoothed the sharp crease and slid the crisp white paper across the scratched laminate table. Valerie looked down at the document. Her eyes tracked the precise $50,000 figure and the fraudulent cabin renovation memo Megan had desperately attached to the bottom. The ambient noise of the diner faded entirely into the background as Valerie processed the exact magnitude of the financial crime sitting in front of her. My daughter-in-law had just used my monitored retirement funds to directly finance Valerie's husband. This was no longer just an ugly domestic dispute over a ruined marriage. It was a documented illegal intersection of our two destroyed families. Valerie did not flinch, and she did not cry. Her jaw tightened as she picked up the paper, her sharp mind instantly dissecting the banking codes and routing numbers printed on the official bank seal. Valerie traced her manicured fingernail over the corporate routing number printed on the bank record. She looked up at me, her eyes as cold and unforgiving as poured concrete. She informed me that Bradley had never officially logged a demolition or rebuild project for my Blue Ridge cabin into their corporate database. He had completely bypassed her entire estimating department to run a shadow operation. I watched her piece the puzzle together with ruthless efficiency. 15 years ago, Valerie built Thorne Construction from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail for every municipal contract and zoning permit in the state. She hired Bradley purely for his charming face and smooth sales pitch to handle the client-facing operations. He had zero equity and absolutely zero structural knowledge. Now he was exploiting the very empire she built to fund his illicit affairs. Valerie pulled out a small tablet from her designer bag and cross-referenced the routing number against her internal company ledgers. She found the exact destination account within seconds. It was a dummy vendor profile Bradley had created under a fake shell corporation. Valerie revealed that Bradley had not just accepted this $50,000 payout from Megan. He had been systematically embezzling company capital for the past 8 months. He was actively draining corporate equipment budgets to buy Megan diamond tennis bracelets and secure lavish hotel suites across the city. Megan believed she was being romanced by a wealthy construction magnate. Bradley was actually courting her using his wife's hard-earned operating capital. The layers of deception were mutually assured destruction. Megan was stealing from my retirement account to pay Bradley, and Bradley was stealing from Valerie's business to impress Megan. I sat back against the rigid vinyl booth and offered Valerie a simple, devastating proposition. We could each walk away right now, file standard civil suits, and let the traditional divorce courts untangle this mess over the next 3 miserable years. Or we could forge a tactical alliance and obliterate them completely by the end of the week. Valerie did not hesitate for a single second. She slid the tablet back into her bag and leaned across the table. She stated with absolute clarity that she had no intention of filing for a simple, quiet divorce. A standard dissolution of marriage would grant Bradley a legal platform to argue for alimony or a division of corporate assets. Valerie intended to strip him of his freedom entirely. She agreed to join my offensive strategy without any reservations. She announced she was immediately retaining a specialized forensic accounting firm to audit the dummy vendor accounts down to the last penny. She planned to file aggressive corporate espionage and grand embezzlement charges against Bradley the moment the audit completed. Furthermore, because Megan had actively wired stolen funds into that specific fraudulent account, Valerie would name my daughter-in-law as a direct co-conspirator in the corporate theft. Megan was about to face federal grand larceny charges from my attorney and corporate embezzlement charges from Valerie's legal team simultaneously. We were building a legal cage with no possible exits or loopholes. Valerie and I shook hands across the table. It was not a gesture of friendship or comfort. It was a binding pact between two architects of destruction who understood exactly how to demolish a faulty structure without suffering any collateral damage. With the legal mechanisms fully locked in place, we needed to synchronize our timelines for maximum public impact. Serving felony warrants in a quiet office or a private living room allows the guilty parties to control the narrative and spin their lies behind closed doors. I wanted them stripped of their carefully constructed facades in front of the very people they were desperately trying to impress. I informed Valerie about the upcoming event my son was organizing. Jalen was hosting a massive, high-profile startup gala this coming Friday night at the city's grandest hotel ballroom. He had invited top-tier angel investors, local politicians, and key tech journalists to officially announce his latest round of funding he firmly believed he had just successfully stolen from my cabin equity. Megan had undoubtedly maxed out another hidden credit card to purchase a custom designer gown for the occasion, planning to parade her fake wealth in front of the city's absolute elite. Valerie's eyes lit up with a dangerous, calculating brilliance. Friday night gave her exactly 48 hours to finalize the forensic audit and secure the corporate arrest warrants from the district attorney. Jonathan would have my federal wire fraud documents and the forged power of attorney completely processed and ready for the federal authorities. We agreed to converge on the grand ballroom right in the middle of Jalen's keynote address. We would let them stand under the brightest spotlights wearing their finest clothes, completely surrounded by their wealthy peers. Then we would drop the guillotine. I finished my black coffee and walked out of the diner. The foundation of their deceit was fully rigged with explosives, and Friday night was the scheduled detonation. I drove straight from the diner to an unassuming industrial park on the outskirts of the city. Jonathan had already arranged for my private investigator to meet me there at a secured warehouse. My investigator spent the last 15 years dismantling white-collar corruption rings for the federal government before entering the private sector. He possessed a unique, ruthless talent for finding the hidden financial threads that connected greedy individuals to their inevitable prison sentences. I parked my truck and walked through the heavy steel doors. He stood waiting by a metal work table with a thick manila folder resting under his hand. He did not offer a greeting. He simply slid the folder across the steel surface. I opened the cover and stared at a photograph of a polished, expensive-looking man in a tailored suit. The name printed boldly at the top of the dossier was Dr. Eris Thorne. The investigator explained that Jalen and Megan had not merely researched mental incompetency laws. They had actively procured a corrupt medical professional to execute their threat. Dr. Thorne was a licensed psychiatrist with a lucrative private practice in the city center. According to the documents inside the folder, he had already signed a preliminary psychiatric hold, declaring me mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. He signed this legal medical document without ever speaking to me, without ever observing me, and without conducting a single clinical evaluation. Jalen and Megan were building an ironclad legal cage to strip away my fundamental human rights. They planned to use this preliminary hold to justify freezing my accounts and forcing me into a state-mandated conservatorship under Jalen's direct control. They were not just stealing my money. They were actively attempting to erase my autonomy entirely. I turned the page of the dossier and stared at the financial documentation my investigator had flawlessly extracted. Dr. Eris Thorne did not risk his medical license out of professional negligence. He risked his medical license for cold, hard cash. He sold his ethics. He sold his signature. He sold my freedom. The bank records printed in the file showed a direct, expedited transfer of $20,000 into the doctor's offshore holding account. I traced the routing numbers with my index finger, confirming the exact origin of the bribe. Jalen had authorized the payment directly from his corporate startup account. He used the very same fraudulent $2 million commercial loan he had secured against my mountain cabin just hours prior. Jalen was utilizing stolen federal funds to finance the medical destruction of his own father. My investigator pointed to a secondary stack of background checks beneath the bank statements. Dr. Thorne possessed a long, highly lucrative history of operating in the shadows of family wealth. He specialized in falsifying competency records for greedy heirs desperate to seize control of family estates. He preyed on the elderly. He preyed on the vulnerable. He preyed on the wealthy. He built his entire luxury practice by providing a medical stamp of approval for ambitious children eager to lock their parents away in high-end facilities. Jalen had actively sought out the most corrupt physician in the state to ensure his hostile takeover went smoothly. The $20,000 was merely a down payment. The contract stipulated another $80,000 upon my successful commitment to a psychiatric ward. My son had put a definitive price tag on my sanity. He valued my total mental destruction at exactly $100,000 of my own stolen equity. I closed the dossier and left the warehouse, driving directly back to the financial district to collect Jonathan. We had gathered every piece of the puzzle. We possessed the forged power of attorney. We possessed the illegal commercial loan documents. We possessed the wire transfer records detailing Megan's grand larceny to silence her lover. We possessed the financial proof of Jalen bribing a corrupt psychiatrist to strip me of my legal rights. It was time to hand this mountain of evidence over to the ultimate authority. Jonathan and I walked through the heavily guarded glass doors of the local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. Jonathan bypassed the front desk and utilized his elite clearance to secure an immediate sit-down with the lead agent of the white-collar crime division. We sat in a sterile, windowless conference room under harsh fluorescent lights. I did not speak. I let Jonathan unleash the full weight of the legal documentation onto the metal table. He methodically walked the federal agent through the timeline. He presented the manipulated signature on the power of attorney. He laid out the $2 million fraudulent loan application processed through a federally insured bank. He exposed Megan's $50,000 wire transfer across state lines to cover up an extramarital affair. Finally, he dropped the dossier detailing Jalen's $20,000 medical bribe to Dr. Thorne. The federal agent reviewed the paperwork in absolute silence. The sheer volume of interconnected felonies was staggering. My son and his wife had committed wire fraud, bank fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit medical fraud, all within a terrifyingly short window of time. They had left a blazing, undeniable trail of digital evidence across multiple federal banking systems. The federal agent closed the final folder and looked up at us with a cold, professional certainty. He confirmed that the evidence provided was absolutely airtight. The moment Jalen routed those stolen funds to pay his commercial rent and bribe a medical professional, he crossed the threshold of a federal conspiracy. The moment Megan wired the stolen retirement funds to Bradley Thorne, she cemented her status as a primary co-conspirator in grand larceny. The agent immediately flagged the case as a high-priority federal investigation. He reached for his desk phone to initiate the process for securing the official arrest warrants from the federal magistrate. Jonathan raised his hand, halting the agent's movement. He proposed a specific, highly coordinated tactical execution. We informed the agent about the major startup gala Jalen was hosting on Friday night. We explained that Jalen and Megan would be standing in the center of the city's most prestigious ballroom, completely surrounded by their wealthy investors, their high society peers, and the local press. It was the perfect, inescapable public stage. The federal agent leaned back in his chair, a slow nod of agreement indicating he understood the psychological impact of our strategy. Executing a raid in a controlled, highly publicized environment would prevent any possibility of a physical escape and immediately freeze all their associated corporate assets in front of their financial backers. The FBI officially agreed to synchronize their raid with our Friday timeline. The federal warrants would be signed, sealed, and ready for deployment by tomorrow evening. I stood up from the metal table and walked out of the federal building with Jonathan. The legal net was completely closed. The trap was set. Jalen and Megan were currently breathing their final hours of freedom. Friday evening arrived with a suffocating blanket of manufactured glamour. The grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel, a property situated completely outside my corporate portfolio, was packed wall to wall with the financial elite. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd with silver trays of champagne and imported caviar. Jalen stood near the center ice sculpture, working the room with the practiced ease of a seasoned con artist. He wore a custom dark navy bespoke suit that draped perfectly over his shoulders, a garment paid for entirely by the fraudulent cabin loan he had drawn down. Beside him, Megan looked like a magazine cover. She wore a floor-length emerald green designer gown that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers. Every sequin on that dress was funded by the $50,000 she had illegally wired from my retirement account just 48 hours prior. They laughed and clinked glasses, absorbing the admiration of their peers. Jalen had spent the last 6 months cultivating relationships with local city council members, the mayor's office, and top-tier angel investors. He invited every single one of them tonight. He intended to use this gala to solidify his public image as the city's next great tech visionary. He needed these politicians to pave the way for highly lucrative municipal contracts, and he needed the investors to see him as an unstoppable force. He was projecting an empire of massive profitability, completely masking the fact that he was currently facing aggressive eviction notices and insurmountable corporate debt. Every smile, every handshake, and every boast was built on a foundation of stolen equity and federal wire fraud. The irony of their arrogance was absolute. They were dancing on a floor paid for by my sweat, completely oblivious to the federal agents waiting in the perimeter. Bradley Thorne lingered near the open bar on the far edge of the ballroom. He wore a rented tuxedo that fit just a fraction too tight across the chest, trying desperately to blend in with the high society crowd. He attended the gala officially listed on the guest manifest as a corporate contractor partner for Jalen's expanding enterprise. The reality of his presence was an inside joke between the adulterers. Megan glanced across the room, catching Bradley's eye. A secretive, deeply arrogant smile passed between them. They shared the thrilling, toxic secret of their affair and the freshly deposited $50,000 sitting in his dummy corporate account. Megan felt invincible. She believed she had successfully silenced her lover with a massive payout while simultaneously keeping her husband completely in the dark. She turned her attention back to the crowd, radiating the false confidence of a woman who thought she had successfully manipulated everyone around her. Jalen remained entirely oblivious to the silent exchange happening right in his own VIP section. He ignored his wife and her supposed contractor completely. His entire focus was locked onto a group of heavy-hitting venture capitalists from Silicon Valley. He desperately needed their secondary capital to fill the massive financial craters in his startup. He pitched his software algorithms with aggressive enthusiasm, promising astronomical returns and completely secure infrastructure. He possessed a terrifying ability to compartmentalize his reality. He actively repressed the memory of coercing my signature and bribing a corrupt psychiatrist. In his mind, he was not a desperate criminal staving off bankruptcy. He was a brilliant self-made entrepreneur destined for greatness. The three of them stood in that ballroom, bound together by a web of corporate theft, infidelity, and elder abuse, each believing they held the ultimate upper hand. The ambient music faded out and a bright spotlight illuminated the main stage at the front of the ballroom. Jalen tapped his champagne flute with a silver spoon, bringing the massive crowd to a respectful silence. He climbed the carpeted stairs to the podium, adjusting the microphone with a perfectly rehearsed look of solemn responsibility. He did not pitch his software or boast about his projected profit margins. Instead, he deployed the ultimate emotional manipulation. He lowered his voice, manufacturing a thick, sorrowful tone, and addressed the hushed crowd. He spoke about the heavy burdens of family and the tragic realities of aging. With fake tears glistening under the stage lights, he announced my rapid, devastating decline into severe dementia. He painted a heartbreaking picture of a strong father losing his brilliant mind, claiming the medical tragedy had deeply altered his perspective on life and business. He told the investors and politicians that taking legal guardianship over my affairs was the hardest decision he had ever made, but it was absolutely necessary for my own protection. The crowd watched with rapt, sympathetic attention. Jalen then seamlessly pivoted his emotional performance into a business pitch. He claimed that the recent massive influx of capital into his tech startup was actually a direct tribute to my legacy. He stated he was using my foundation of hard work to build a future I would have been proud of, dedicating his next software launch to the memory of my fading intellect. It was a masterpiece of sociopathic theater. He was publicly laundering his stolen money through a fabricated medical tragedy, weaponizing my manufactured insanity to secure even more blind investment from the weeping billionaires in the front row. He played the grieving, loyal son flawlessly. The ballroom erupted into thunderous, sustained applause. The investors in the front row rose to their feet, offering a standing ovation to the brave, self-sacrificing son who was allegedly carrying his dying father's legacy into the future. Megan stood near the front, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Bradley raised his glass from the back of the room in a mocking salute. Jalen absorbed the adulation, bowing his head humbly while gripping the edges of the wooden podium. He had achieved his ultimate fantasy. He was rich, respected, and completely insulated from his crimes. The applause reached a deafening crescendo. Then the heavy oak double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open with a massive echoing crash that cut through the cheering like a gunshot. The heavy wood slammed violently against the brass wall stops. The sudden violent noise severed the applause instantly. Hundreds of heads whipped around toward the back of the room in utter shock. The grand entrance was flooded with the harsh, cold light of the hallway. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the center aisle. I did not stumble. I did not shuffle. My posture was absolute dominant steel. I wore a sharply tailored, dark charcoal suit that commanded immediate authority. I leveled my gaze directly at the stage. My eyes locked onto Jalen with the cold, unblinking intensity of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. The silence in the ballroom became suffocating. The whispers died in their throats. The pathetic, confused old man they were just weeping for was striding down the center aisle with the terrifying, undeniable presence of an executioner. The gala of lies was officially over. The applause died. It did not fade into a murmur. It stopped entirely, severed by a blade of pure shock. Hundreds of wealthy investors, prominent politicians, and aggressive tech journalists turned their heads simultaneously toward the grand entrance. They expected a latecomer. They saw a ghost. Jalen froze at the polished wooden podium. His hands gripped the sharp edges of the speaker's stand. His knuckles turned stark white against the mahogany. The fabricated tears on his cheeks dried instantly under the glaring exposure of reality. The sorrowful, devoted son vanished. The terrified, cornered thief appeared. His posture crumpled, betraying the confident narrative he had just woven. Down in the VIP front row, Megan stood paralyzed. She held a long crystal champagne flute in her right hand. Her floor-length emerald green designer gown shimmered uselessly under the chandeliers. The dress was a trophy of grand larceny purchased entirely with stolen retirement funds. She stared at me, her eyes wide with primal panic. Her perfectly manicured fingers went entirely numb. The crystal flute slipped from her grasp. It plummeted toward the floor. It hit the polished marble tile. The glass shattered loudly. The sharp, piercing sound of breaking crystal echoed throughout the cavernous, absolutely silent ballroom. It was the only sound left in the room. The shattered glass mirrored the shattered illusion of their high society life. The crowd held its collective breath. They watched the ruined glass scattered across the marble. They watched the terrified wife in the front row. They watched the frozen, speechless son on the stage. I did not look at the crowd. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the podium. Jalen's mouth opened, but no words came out. The microphone picked up his shallow breathing. He looked at me, realizing the dying old man he had invented for the bank was a complete documented fabrication. The trap was irrevocably sprung. The audience waited for the script to continue, but the script belonged to me now. I stepped forward into the harsh light of the chandeliers. I began my slow, deliberate descent down the center aisle of the ballroom. I walked with the heavy, measured strides of a man who had spent 30 years commanding massive commercial construction sites. I had spent 3 decades navigating treacherous steel beams, silencing roaring diesel engines, and managing hundreds of hardened laborers with a single sharp command. I knew exactly how to project physical authority. I knew exactly how to dominate a chaotic space without raising my voice. I did not rush my approach. I did not falter in my step. Whispers began to erupt from the velvet-lined tables as I passed. Angel investors leaned in close, murmuring frantically about the sudden interruption. Tech journalists raised their heavy cameras, sensing a volatile shift in the atmosphere. I ignored the rising whispers entirely. I ignored the rapid clicking of flashing cameras entirely. I ignored the confused politicians entirely. My focus remained absolute, locked on the man standing behind the microphone. I reached the base of the stage. I climbed the carpeted stairs without a single trace of physical hesitation. The fake, violent tremors I had performed for Jalen's benefit days ago were entirely absent. I approached the podium with overwhelming momentum. Jalen shrank backward instinctively. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. His expensive, bespoke suit suddenly looked like a borrowed costume draped over a frightened boy. I reached out and took the microphone directly from his trembling hand. He did not resist. He could not resist. The psychological weight of my presence paralyzed him. I adjusted the heavy microphone stand, pulling it up to my height. I gripped the sides of the podium, anchoring myself precisely where my son had just delivered his masterful lie. Jalen stood uselessly to my left, stripped of his narrative and his power. The ballroom remained in a state of suffocating suspense. They had just applauded a eulogy for my mind. They were now staring at the resurrected, unyielding reality. I looked out over the sprawling sea of expensive suits and glittering evening gowns. The silence was absolute, thick with anticipation and dread. I leaned into the microphone. My voice echoed across the massive room, deep, resonant, and entirely steady. I thanked my son for his incredibly touching presentation. I thanked him for the beautiful, tragic eulogy regarding my declining mental state. I thanked him for gathering the city's finest to mourn a tragedy that simply did not exist. A collective gasp rippled through the VIP rows. I swept my gaze systematically across the crowd, making direct eye contact with the lead venture capitalists who had just promised millions to my son. I assured them with absolute terrifying clarity that my mind was perfectly intact. My mind was sharp enough to build a massive corporate empire from nothing. My mind was sharp enough to secure extensive commercial real estate holdings across this city. My mind was sharp enough to watch my own son forge my legal signature on a federal banking document without blinking. The structural repetition of the absolute truth struck the room like physical blows. I stated clearly that the tragic dementia they had just wept for was a calculated lie. I stated clearly that the emotional struggle they had just applauded was a calculated lie. I stated clearly that the very financial foundation of Jalen's new startup funding was a calculated lie. I explained to the silent room that the $2 million currently fueling this operation did not come from brilliant tech innovations. It came from a fraudulent commercial loan taken illegally against my personal property. The investors in the front row visibly stiffened. The politicians subtly shifted their chairs away from the center tables, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. The journalists scrambled to record every devastating word. I dismantled Jalen's curated reality sentence by agonizing sentence. I stripped his corporate illusion down to the bare, ugly bone. Jalen finally snapped out of his paralyzed, terrified stupor. The sheer panic of watching his investors recoil drove him into desperate, flailing action. He lunged toward the podium, reaching wildly across the wood to snatch the microphone from my grip. He shouted to the bewildered crowd that I was having a severe hallucinatory episode. He screamed that I was deeply confused, dangerous, and needed immediate medical restraint. He frantically waved his hand toward the back of the enormous ballroom, aggressively signaling the hotel security detail. 4 large men in dark tactical uniforms immediately stepped forward from the shadows near the catering exits, moving rapidly down the center aisle to physically remove me from the stage. Jalen thought he could still control the physical environment. He thought brute force could successfully silence the overwhelming truth. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open a second time. Jonathan Hayes stepped into the blinding light of the grand chandeliers. My attorney walked with the terrifying, unyielding confidence of a man holding executed federal warrants. Valerie Thorne walked deliberately by his side. She wore a sharp, tailored black trench coat, projecting a cold, furious corporate power that instantly froze the room's chaotic energy. She locked her concrete gaze directly onto Bradley, who was frantically trying to edge his way out of the crowd toward a side emergency exit. Jonathan raised a single commanding hand in the air. He did not shout over the noise. He spoke with the quiet, crushing authority of federal law. He commanded the advancing security guards to stand down immediately. He announced to the packed room that any physical interference would be considered direct obstruction of an active federal investigation. The 4 security guards stopped dead in their tracks. They looked at Jonathan's official credentials. They looked at the heavy leather briefcases packed with federal indictments. They immediately took 3 large steps backward, melting away from the center aisle and abandoning their post. Jalen's last line of physical defense completely evaporated. He was entirely isolated on the brightly lit stage, completely surrounded by his own impending ruin. Section 12. The fraud exposed. I stood in the center of the brightly lit stage and slowly turned my head toward Jonathan Hayes. I did not need to utter a single command. My attorney understood the precise mechanics of this execution. Jonathan stepped forward from the shadows of the grand double doors and walked down the center aisle. He moved with the terrifying, unyielding confidence of a man holding the power of total financial destruction in his briefcase. The private security guards had already melted away into the background, fully neutralized by his federal credentials. Jonathan ascended the carpeted stairs and joined me behind the heavy wooden podium. I stepped aside, relinquishing the physical space, and handed him the microphone. I watched my son's chest heave with rapid, shallow breaths. I watched Megan grip the edge of the VIP table so tightly her knuckles turned white. I watched the entire ballroom hold its collective breath. Jonathan did not tap the microphone. He did not clear his throat. He did not ask for their attention. He simply claimed it. He introduced himself to the hushed crowd as the senior managing partner of Hayes & Associates and the exclusive director of the Mitchell Life Estate Trust. He listed his corporate credentials with cold, mechanical precision. The room consisted of elite venture capitalists, seasoned brokers, and hardened politicians. They respected absolute legal authority, and they inherently feared severe legal consequences. Jonathan established his dominance within 10 seconds. He looked out over the sea of expensive suits and stated clearly that the elaborate celebration they were attending was a complete fabrication. He announced that the man standing trembling on the stage was not a self-made tech visionary. He was a desperate drowning debtor masquerading as a massive success. The carefully curated reality of Jalen's high society life was instantly shattered in front of his most important audience. Jonathan did not allow the initial wave of shock to settle before delivering the fatal blow. He lifted a thick, sealed legal folder from his side and held it up high under the glaring crystal chandeliers. He announced to the packed room of financial experts that the $2 million cash injection currently securing Jalen's tech startup was entirely fraudulent. The words struck the silent ballroom like a physical shockwave. Jonathan is an apex predator in the corporate legal world. He knows exactly how the minds of elite investors operate. Investors thrive on calculated risk, but they possess a deep, primal hatred for criminal liability. Criminal liability is a highly infectious disease in the financial sector, and Jonathan was expertly diagnosing Jalen as patient zero. He systematically detailed the exact mechanics of my son's crime to the terrified audience. He explained that Jalen had completely bypassed standard corporate funding avenues and instead utilized a forged power of attorney to illegally secure a massive commercial loan against my private mountain property. He ruthlessly stripped away the emotional lies Jalen had just peddled about honoring my legacy. He replaced those pathetic lies with the cold, undeniable facts of federal wire fraud and systemic elder abuse. Jonathan outlined how the stolen equity was instantly transferred across state banking lines to cover up the startup's catastrophic internal operating debts. He exposed the horrific truth that every single dollar fueling this lavish gala and every single promise of future software development was built entirely on stolen federal funds. The investors began to shift violently in their velvet chairs. The toxic nature of the money was now a matter of public, undeniable record. By investing in Jalen's company, they were inadvertently tying their own pristine portfolios to a documented federal crime. The panic in the room was palpable, rapid, and completely irreversible. The lead investor from the primary Silicon Valley firm suddenly stood up from the front table, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. His face was flushed with absolute fury. He was a man who managed billions of dollars in clean, legitimate capital, and he had just realized he was being publicly humiliated by a small-time con artist. He pointed a sharp, accusing finger directly at Jalen and demanded an immediate, coherent explanation. Jalen opened his mouth, but only pathetic, fragmented stammers escaped his throat. He had absolutely no defense against the truth crashing down around him. Jonathan did not wait for my son to compose a new, desperate lie. My attorney stepped down from the elevated stage and walked directly to the lead investor's table. Jonathan opened his heavy leather briefcase and withdrew the official federal fraud report. The document had been generated, verified, and stamped by the Federal Bureau of Investigation earlier that exact afternoon. Jonathan handed the crisp, undeniable proof directly to the furious billionaire. The lead investor snatched the paper and scrutinized the heavy federal seals. He read the exact transaction logs detailing the illegal wire transfers. He analyzed the documented evidence of the forged power of attorney. He understood the massive, catastrophic legal exposure his venture capital firm now faced by associating with my son. The investor did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He slammed the federal report down onto the white tablecloth. He turned to his associates and loudly ordered his entire team to pull every single cent of their funding immediately. The brutal command echoed across the silent ballroom. The domino effect triggered instantly. The other financial backers at the surrounding tables scrambled to their feet in sheer panic. They grabbed their briefcases and their coats, verbally severing all ties with the startup to protect their own reputations. Jalen watched his entire glorious future evaporate into thin air. The polished, untouchable entrepreneur completely broke down. He rushed to the edge of the stage, his bespoke suit twisting awkwardly around his panicked, frantic frame. He screamed across the retreating crowd, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered desperation. He pointed a shaking, accusatory hand directly at my chest. He yelled that I was the one who signed the banking document. He shouted to the departing investors that I had personally authorized the massive transfer, that the ink on the paper belonged to me, and that I had willingly given him the keys to the corporate kingdom. He desperately expected the confused, vulnerable old man to absorb the blame and save his sinking ship. He expected me to cower under his public rage and validate his illusions. I looked at him with absolute freezing contempt. I stepped smoothly up to the microphone stand. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic hysteria. I spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity that commanded the remaining attention in the room. I looked my son dead in the eyes and told him the absolute truth. I stated that I had indeed signed a piece of paper that morning. I explained that I deliberately skipped my required middle initial. I explained that I intentionally warped the final letter of my legal signature to trigger an automatic federal fraud alert within my primary banking institution. I told him I signed a meticulously constructed, undeniable legal trap. I laid the snare in plain sight, fully hoping he would prove my worst fears wrong. I told him he walked right into that trap with his own two greedy hands. His arrogance destroyed his judgment, and his greed officially destroyed his freedom. Valerie Thorne did not wait for the chaotic murmurs to swell back into a roar. She stepped out from Jonathan's shadow with the terrifying, absolute precision of a corporate executioner. She wore a sharp-tailored black trench coat, projecting a cold, furious power that instantly dominated the remaining oxygen in the room. She walked directly to the center of the grand ballroom. She walked past the fleeing venture capitalists. She walked past the trembling tech journalists. She walked past the shattered remnants of Megan's crystal champagne flute. Her eyes locked entirely onto my daughter-in-law. Megan froze under the immense weight of Valerie's unblinking concrete gaze. The emerald green designer gown suddenly looked like a cheap, heavy shroud clinging to a terrified imposter. Valerie reached into the deep pocket of her tailored coat. She withdrew a thick, heavy stack of high-resolution printed photographs. She did not hand them over politely. She did not offer a private, dignified conversation to spare Megan's feelings. She raised her hand and threw the entire stack violently onto the pristine white tablecloth of the primary VIP dining table. The heavy, glossy paper slapped against the solid wood with a sharp, undeniable crack that echoed into the rafters. The photographs fanned out across the table under the glaring, unforgiving light of the crystal chandeliers. Every single guest remaining in the vicinity leaned in, involuntarily drawn by the morbid gravitational pull of the scandal. Every single eye dropped to the scattered, vivid images. Valerie stood perfectly still at the head of the table. She commanded the physical space. She commanded the dead silence. She commanded the total, absolute destruction of Megan's carefully constructed high society facade without raising her voice a single decibel. The glossy photographs displayed exactly what Bradley and Megan firmly believed would remain forever hidden in the remote, isolated mountains. The images captured Bradley and Megan entwined on the front wooden deck of my Blue Ridge cabin. The images captured Bradley and Megan sharing intimate, arrogant smiles over expensive imported glasses of wine. The images captured the absolute, undeniable reality of their illicit, ongoing affair. Valerie did not lower her voice to preserve anyone's dignity. She projected her words across the ballroom with the lethal, cutting clarity of a woman who had built an industrial empire from scratch and suffered zero fools in her presence. She announced to the paralyzed listening crowd that the beautiful, elegant woman standing before them was not a successful entrepreneur's loyal wife. She announced that Megan was a desperate, morally bankrupt thief. Valerie declared with absolute vocal dominance that Megan had systematically wired $50,000 of stolen retirement funds directly into a dummy corporate account. She stated that Megan stole this massive sum from an elderly man she publicly claimed to love and respect. She stated that Megan funneled this stolen capital securely and directly to Bradley Thorne. She stated that this $50,000 transaction was not for a legitimate cabin renovation, but a direct, documented, and desperate payment for sexual favors. The gasp that echoed through the grand ballroom was visceral, deep, and collective. Valerie systematically laid bare the absolute rot at the very core of Megan's existence. Megan had stolen my future to buy Bradley's attention. Megan had exploited my equity to fund a pathetic hidden romance. The high society guests stared at Megan with unmasked, visceral disgust. She was no longer a glamorous hostess. She was a documented embezzler standing in the blinding spotlight of her own sins. Bradley Thorne realized his survival window was rapidly and violently closing. The arrogant, secretive smile he had shared with Megan mere minutes ago across the ballroom was entirely wiped from his face. Pure, unadulterated panic consumed his sharp features. He spun around on his heels, desperate to escape the blinding, suffocating exposure of the gala. He lunged toward the heavy brass handles of the side emergency exit, moving with the frantic energy of a cornered rat. He intended to slip away into the dark night, completely abandoning Megan to face the federal authorities and the public humiliation alone. He reached the heavy metal door, but a massive wall of black fabric blocked his path. Valerie had not come to this venue alone. Two of her elite private corporate security guards stepped directly in front of the exit, folding their thick arms across their chests. They were large, immovable mountains of disciplined muscle. Bradley slammed into them and bounced off entirely, hopelessly trapped within the brightly lit room. Valerie walked slowly, methodically toward her cornered, pathetic husband. She held all the financial power in their dynamic. She held all the corporate power in their dynamic. She held his entire pathetic future in her perfectly manicured hands. She pulled two crisp, thick legal folders from her leather briefcase. She handed the first folder to Bradley, announcing loudly that it contained immediate, non-negotiable divorce papers stripping him of any and all claim to her vast assets. She handed the second folder to Bradley, announcing it contained his immediate permanent notice of corporate termination from Thorne Construction. She stripped him of his executive salary. She stripped him of his company car. She stripped him of his platinum expense accounts. She left him instantly, absolutely, and totally penniless. Jalen stood frozen behind the heavy mahogany podium, his mind violently and erratically processing the catastrophic collapse of his entire carefully built world. The sudden federal fraud exposure had already demolished his company, his public reputation, and his impending freedom. Now Valerie's brutal, calculated revelation detonated the final rotting pillar of his existence. He slowly turned his head away from Jonathan and locked his hollow, bloodshot eyes directly onto Megan. The horrific, undeniable reality of his wife's infidelity crashed into him simultaneously with the crushing, suffocating weight of his financial ruin. He realized that while he was risking federal prison to forge loan documents and bribe corrupt psychiatrists, his wife was utilizing that exact stolen capital to finance her lover. He stared at the woman he had conspired with in the dark. He stared at the woman he had lied to the federal banks for. He stared at the woman he had attempted to mentally destroy his own father for. The manufactured high society love they projected to the world evaporated instantly into the cold air. It was entirely replaced by a pure, toxic, and absolutely suffocating hatred. Megan stared back at Jalen, her chest heaving with rapid breaths, desperately searching his face for any shred of protection, comfort, or solidarity. She found absolutely nothing but venomous rage. The perfect, glamorous power couple dissolved right in front of the silent, watching crowd. They turned into vicious, feral enemies in the span of 60 agonizing seconds. Jalen screamed at Megan, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered fury, cursing her for ruining the fragile criminal empire they had built. Megan screamed back, her designer facade shattering completely, blaming Jalen's massive, hidden startup debts for forcing her into desperate measures. They were entirely consumed by their mutual destruction. Jalen's suffocating dread twisted instantly into feral, unhinged violence. He had spent his entire life projecting his personal failures onto anyone within his immediate reach. He refused to accept the blame for his collapsing startup. He refused to accept the blame for the federal fraud charges currently hanging over his head. Now staring at the physical embodiment of his marital humiliation, he found the perfect scapegoat. Bradley stood completely paralyzed by Valerie's termination notice, his eyes darting frantically toward the blocked exits. Jalen did not hesitate. He lunged across the distance, separating them with the raw, desperate energy of a completely broken man. He drove his closed fist squarely into Bradley's jaw. The sharp, sickening crack of bone against bone echoed across the VIP dining section. Bradley stumbled backward, his hands flailing blindly as he crashed into a towering floral arrangement. The heavy crystal vase shattered into hundreds of jagged pieces across the polished marble floor. Jalen did not stop. He tackled the larger man to the ground. The pristine, elegant gala instantly devolved into an arena of visceral carnage. Jalen threw wild, uncalculated punches, screaming incoherent curses at the man who had gladly accepted his stolen funds. Bradley fought back with sheer survival instinct, driving his elbow into Jalen's ribs and rolling them both heavily across the floor. They crashed into a pristine catering table. The table folded under their combined weight, sending a massive avalanche of silver platters, imported caviar, and champagne cascading over their thrashing bodies. The remaining high society guests scrambled backward in absolute terror, pulling their expensive gowns and tailored suits out of the line of fire. The wealthy investors watched the man they had just hailed as a visionary entrepreneur roll in broken glass and spilled liquor. Jalen was completely destroying the last remaining shreds of his professional dignity. He struck his rival again and again. He struck the mirror of his own failure. He struck the thief of his wife. He struck the architect of his public humiliation. Megan did not run away from the violent spectacle. She did not cover her face in shame. The absolute destruction of her high society facade unleashed a vicious, cornered fury. She lunged into the center of the brawl, grabbing the back of Jalen's bespoke suit and hauling him away from her bruised and bleeding lover. She screamed at her husband with a voice that bordered on absolute hysteria. She defended the affair with brutal, unapologetic venom. She defended the theft of my retirement funds as a necessary survival tactic. She defended the man bleeding on the floor because he represented the only tangible escape from her miserable reality. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Jalen's face and publicly tore his financial illusions to shreds. She announced to the horrified listening ballroom that Jalen was entirely responsible for their impending bankruptcy. She screamed that his catastrophic business decisions had drained their accounts, ruined their credit, and pushed them to the absolute brink of eviction. She told the crowd that Jalen was not a brilliant tech visionary, but an incompetent, desperate failure who could not even afford the rent on their luxury apartment. She blamed his relentless pursuit of status for forcing her to find comfort and financial security in another man's arms. She blamed his absolute incompetence for driving her to orchestrate the wire fraud. She placed every single ounce of guilt squarely onto his shoulders, refusing to accept any personal accountability for the grand larceny she had committed. She used her words as weapons, systematically dismantling his ego in front of the very people he had spent months trying to impress. She humiliated him. She emasculated him. She exposed the pathetic, hollow core of his entire existence. The public emasculation was the final, devastating trigger. Jalen's mind completely fractured under the weight of Megan's vicious accusations. He stood surrounded by shattered crystal and ruined champagne, breathing heavily as he stared at the woman who had just annihilated his manhood. He raised his hand and slapped Megan fiercely across the face. The sharp, violent sound of the impact silenced the few remaining murmurs in the ballroom. Megan stumbled backward, clutching her stinging cheek, her eyes wide with shock. Jalen screamed that she was a parasitic leech. He screamed that her insatiable greed and endless demands for designer clothes had forced him to take out the fraudulent loan. He screamed that she had single-handedly ruined his startup, his reputation, and his life. He blamed her entirely for the federal investigation closing in around them. Megan's shock instantly mutated back into pure, concentrated malice. She did not cower. She stood her ground and delivered the ultimate fatal blow to Jalen's remaining humanity. She shrieked that he had ruined his own life the moment he decided to lock his own father inside a psychiatric ward. She hurled the horrific truth across the silent room, ensuring every single remaining investor heard the exact details of his treason. She announced that Jalen had actively bribed a corrupt doctor to declare his healthy father mentally incompetent. She exposed his plot to drug his father, hijack the estate, and force me into a locked, state-mandated medical prison just to steal the mountain cabin equity. She made certain the entire city knew that the loving son they had applauded minutes earlier was actually a monster willing to sacrifice his father's mind for a business transaction. They tore each other apart piece by piece. They weaponized their darkest secrets. They ensured mutual absolute destruction. I stood at the edge of the shattered VIP section and watched the chaos unfold with absolute unyielding calm. I did not step forward to separate them. I did not raise my voice to command order. I did not lift a single finger to stop the violent, pathetic spectacle unraveling on the marble floor. I watched the empire burn. I watched the lies dissolve. I watched the architects of my destruction turn on each other like starving wolves in a cage. The federal agents were waiting outside the doors, and the financial backers had completely evaporated, but this specific punishment required no external authority. This punishment was entirely self-inflicted. Jalen and Megan had built a massive, precarious tower entirely out of deception, vanity, and unrelenting greed. Now, stripped of their stolen capital and their false public narratives, they possessed absolutely nothing but their mutual hatred. They were dismantling their own lives brick by stolen brick, using nothing but the ugly, undeniable truth. The high society guests who had stayed to witness the carnage looked on with undisguised horror. The elegant gala had transformed into a public execution of character. Jonathan Hayes stood quietly to my left, his federal documents securely locked inside his leather briefcase. Valerie Thorne stood to my right, her vengeance against Bradley completely satisfied. We did not need to issue any further threats. We did not need to file any additional civil lawsuits. We simply allowed the toxic foundation of their marriage to implode under the blinding light of public exposure. I looked at the son I had raised and the daughter-in-law I had welcomed into my home. They were completely ruined. The trap had closed, the poison was drawn out, and the ledger was permanently balanced. The vicious argument echoing across the ruined VYP section was suddenly drowned out by the piercing wail of approaching sirens. Through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom, frantic flashes of red and blue light violently painted the crystal chandeliers. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance burst open for a third and final time. This time it was not an attorney or a betrayed spouse. A highly coordinated task force of federal agents and local police officers poured into the room, moving with ruthless tactical precision. The lead FBI agent I had met with earlier marched straight down the center aisle, flanked by heavily armed local enforcement. They wore dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their backs. The Federal Bureau does not take elder financial abuse lightly, especially when the paper trail spans multiple jurisdictions and involves corrupt medical professionals. They target these precise conspiracies to set public, undeniable precedents. The agents fanned out across the marble floor, securing every exit and cutting off any possible avenue of retreat. The violent, pathetic brawl involving Jalen, Megan, and Bradley evaporated instantly in the face of overwhelming state power. Officers physically separated my son from his bleeding contractor, throwing them both against the nearest intact catering table. The remaining high society guests who had lingered to watch the carnage now scrambled backward against the walls, completely terrified by the sudden influx of federal uniforms. The entire atmosphere of the gala collapsed under the crushing weight of the law. The music was long dead. The elegant facade was entirely broken. The room now belonged entirely to the authorities, and the trap I had meticulously built with Jonathan was finally snapping shut around their throats. The lead federal agent bypassed the cowering guests and walked directly up to my son. Jalen was panting heavily, his custom Navy suit torn and stained with spilled champagne and Bradley's blood. He tried to straighten his posture, attempting one last pathetic projection of corporate authority, but the agent completely ignored his performance. The agent grabbed Jalen by the shoulder, spun him around roughly, and slammed his chest against the polished wood of the speaker's podium. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the silent ballroom as the restraints locked tightly around Jalen's wrists. The agent leaned in close and began reading my son his Miranda rights with a loud, booming voice that carried to every corner of the room. He did not whisper to preserve Jalen's dignity. He officially placed Jalen under federal arrest for felony wire fraud, grand bank fraud, and the forgery of a federal banking document. Furthermore, he explicitly cited the charge of conspiracy to commit elder abuse and medical fraud. The agent stated clearly that Jalen was being indicted for attempting to illegally incarcerate a senior citizen through bribery to steal a $2 million real estate asset. Jalen thrashed against the podium, screaming that there was a massive misunderstanding, that he was a legitimate tech entrepreneur, and that the federal government was making a catastrophic mistake. The agent pressed his weight against my son's back, forcing him into total submission. The investors who had previously applauded Jalen's emotional speeches now watched him squirm like a common street criminal. His entire empire of lies, built on my sweat and stolen equity, officially burned to ashes. He was no longer the brilliant CEO of tomorrow. He was a federal inmate waiting for transport. A secondary team of federal agents immediately descended upon Megan. She stood shivering near the shattered remnants of the ice sculpture, her emerald green designer gown soaked in spilled alcohol. She tried to step backward, shaking her head and frantically claiming that she was completely innocent, that her husband had controlled all the finances, and that she had no knowledge of the forged power of attorney. A female FBI agent firmly grabbed Megan's arms, pulling them behind her back with practiced efficiency. She informed my daughter-in-law that her arrest had absolutely nothing to do with her husband's startup loan. She officially charged Megan with grand larceny and identity theft, detailing the illegal $50,000 wire transfer she had initiated from my monitored retirement account. Megan screamed in absolute panic as the cold steel handcuffs locked around her wrists. She realized simultaneously that Valerie Thorne's forensic accountants had already handed their irrefutable evidence over to the federal authorities. Across the room, local police officers hauled Bradley Thorne to his feet. His face was badly bruised from Jalen's frantic punches, and his rented tuxedo was entirely ruined. An officer informed Bradley that he was being officially detained for questioning regarding systemic corporate embezzlement and the receipt of stolen federal funds. Valerie stood a few feet away, watching her soon-to-be ex-husband being dragged toward the heavy double doors. She offered him a final icy smile, confirming that his permanent financial ruin was now a matter of public record. Bradley hung his head in total defeat, realizing the $50,000 he had accepted for his illicit silence had ultimately purchased his ticket to a federal interrogation room. The entire trio of traitors was successfully neutralized, bound in steel, and marching toward decades of mandatory incarceration. The federal agents began physically marching the suspects down the center aisle toward the flashing red and blue lights waiting outside the lobby. As the lead agent dragged Jalen away from the podium, my son dug the heels of his ruined leather shoes into the carpet. He twisted his upper body around, fighting against the heavy steel restraints, and locked his terrified, bloodshot eyes directly onto me. The arrogant tech visionary was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified child facing the ultimate consequences of his immense greed. He screamed my name across the grand ballroom, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He begged me to intervene. He pleaded with me to tell the federal agents that this was all a massive family misunderstanding. He shrieked that I was his father, that I loved him, and that I possessed the power to call off the entire investigation right now. He demanded that I protect him one final time. I stood perfectly still near the edge of the shattered VIP tables, completely unbothered by his desperate, flailing performance. I looked at the man who had actively planned to drug my coffee, erase my autonomy, and lock me inside a psychiatric ward just to steal the cabin I built with my bare hands. I looked at him with eyes as hard and unforgiving as solid flint. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I did not offer him a single ounce of forgiveness. I adjusted the lapels of my dark charcoal suit, turned my back on his pathetic screaming, and walked steadily toward the secondary exit. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, stepping out of the toxic, suffocating gala and directly into the cool, quiet freedom of the night. I left the flashing lights of the hotel behind and drove with Jonathan directly to the federal precinct. The processing of high-level, white-collar criminals operates with brutal, sterile efficiency. Inside the concrete walls of the federal building, the glamorous facade of the gala was entirely stripped away, replaced by cinder-block walls and heavy steel doors. Jalen sat confined inside Interrogation Room A. The bespoke Navy suit that had projected such immense power just 2 hours ago now looked rumpled and pathetic under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. 2 seasoned federal agents walked into the small room and placed a thick stack of banking documents onto the metal table. They did not raise their voices. They simply asked him to explain the forged signature on the commercial loan application. Jalen did not ask for a lawyer immediately. His monumental arrogance convinced him he could talk his way out of a federal indictment. He immediately deployed his designated scapegoat. He leaned across the metal table and blamed the entire fraudulent operation on his wife. He claimed he was merely a software visionary, a man entirely consumed by coding algorithms and product development, while Megan handled all the corporate and personal finances. He swore to the federal agents that Megan had manipulated the legal paperwork behind his back. He stated with feigned outrage that she must have forged my signature on the power of attorney to secure the loan without his explicit knowledge. He painted himself as the oblivious, trusting husband who had been financially victimized by a greedy spouse. He actively offered to testify against her if the Bureau granted him immunity. He was willing to trade his wife's freedom for his own without a single second of hesitation. Directly across the narrow cinderblock hallway, Megan sat confined inside Interrogation Room B. She took an entirely different tactical approach. The federal agents assigned to her room placed the wire transfer logs detailing the $50,000 stolen from my retirement account onto the table. Megan did not try to deny the transaction. The digital footprint was absolutely undeniable. Instead, she buried her face in her hands and manufactured a violent, hysterical weeping fit. She weaponized her tears, playing the role of the terrified, abused spouse. She claimed through her calculated sobs that Jalen was a financial tyrant with an explosive, uncontrollable temper. She swore to the agents that her husband had physically threatened her, forcing her to access my secure accounts and execute the wire transfer against her will. When the agents pressed her about the destination of the money, she brazenly doubled down on her lies. She claimed she had absolutely no idea who Bradley Thorne was or why Jalen wanted the money sent to his dummy corporation. She completely erased her own infidelity from the narrative, framing the payout as just another one of Jalen's shady business deals that she was coerced into facilitating. The federal prosecutors heavily rely on the prisoner's dilemma to break unloyal couples, fully understanding that greedy conspirators will always turn on each other to secure a lighter sentence. Megan was executing that exact behavioral pattern flawlessly. She stated she was willing to sign a full confession detailing Jalen's entire history of financial incompetence and violent coercion, provided the federal prosecutors dropped the grand larceny charges against her. She was actively building a legal coffin for her husband, hoping to climb over his incarcerated body to secure her own survival. Jonathan and I stood quietly behind the one-way glass of the central observation room, watching the two traitors systematically attempt to destroy one another. The federal agents had allowed us to remain in the secure facility to finalize the formal victim impact statements regarding the elder abuse charges. The lead investigator from the white-collar division stepped into the observation room looking highly unsatisfied. He noted that while both suspects were rapidly incriminating each other, their conflicting testimonies could potentially complicate the timeline of the initial forgery. Jonathan simply adjusted his tie and opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out a secure digital drive provided by my private investigator earlier that afternoon. My investigator possessed resources that extended far beyond standard financial audits. During his background check on Jalen's startup, he had legally obtained an archived audio file from the company's internal cloud server. Jalen, obsessed with recording his own corporate meetings to capture his supposed brilliance, had failed to secure his personal digital backups. Jonathan handed the drive to the lead agent. He explained that the drive contained a crystal-clear, unedited audio recording of Jalen sitting in his own executive office speaking directly to Megan. The audio captured the exact moment they orchestrated the entire conspiracy. Jonathan detailed the contents of the tape before hitting play. The recording featured Jalen explicitly ordering Megan to practice forging my signature. It featured Jalen openly discussing the $20,000 bribe intended for Dr. Eris Thorne. It featured both of them laughing coldly about locking me in a psychiatric ward to gain unfettered access to the mountain cabin equity. It was the ultimate, irrefutable confession captured entirely in their own arrogant voices. The lead federal agent took the digital drive and walked briskly back into interrogation room A. Jalen was still leaning across the metal table, aggressively pitching his fabricated narrative of victimhood. He was still demanding that the agents go across the hall and press Megan for the truth about the forged documents. The lead agent did not engage with his frantic demands. He did not ask any further questions. He simply plugged the digital drive into the secure laptop resting on the edge of the table and pressed play. Jalen's own arrogant, confident voice filled the small concrete room. The recording broadcasted his exact instructions on how to bypass the bank's security protocols. It broadcasted his cruel, calculating laughter regarding my supposed dementia. It broadcasted his explicit confirmation of the medical bribe. Jalen's jaw dropped. The color permanently drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The confident tech CEO vanished entirely, completely hollowed out by the sound of his own undeniable guilt. His elaborate defense crumbled into dust in a matter of seconds. He realized in that exact moment that he possessed absolutely zero leverage. He had no scapegoat left to sacrifice. He could not blame Megan for a conspiracy he was recorded actively directing. He could not claim ignorance regarding the medical fraud he was recorded funding. He looked at the federal agents, his eyes wide with the crushing, suffocating realization of his permanent defeat. The betrayal he had orchestrated against his own father had returned to obliterate him entirely. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room locked securely, sealing him inside a cage of his own flawless construction. There was no escape, no negotiation, and no future left to manipulate. 3 days after the steel doors of the federal precinct locked shut, the institutional dismantling of Jalen and Megan's life began with mechanical, merciless speed. Federal banks do not wait for criminal court verdicts when massive wire fraud is officially confirmed by the authorities. They move instantly and ruthlessly to aggressively recover their exposed capital. At precisely 8 in the morning, a convoy of dark government vehicles pulled into the circular driveway of the sprawling modern luxury estate Jalen had purchased to project his false success. A team of armed federal marshals stepped out onto the manicured lawn. They did not knock politely to request entry. They bypassed the high-tech security gates and marched directly to the towering glass front doors. The lead marshal slapped a heavy, brightly colored foreclosure notice directly onto the pristine glass. The document officially stated that the $2 million commercial loan Jalen had secured through criminal forgery triggered an immediate, non-negotiable collateral forfeiture. Because the funds were intrinsically tied to a documented federal crime, the banking institution invoked their right to absolute instant seizure. Professional moving crews hired by the bank swarmed the property immediately behind the marshals. They began systematically hauling out the custom-made Italian leather furniture, the imported modern art pieces, and the massive flat-screen televisions. They stripped the lavish house down to its bare, hollow drywall. The neighbors who had previously attended Megan's glamorous weekend cocktail parties now stood on their manicured lawns and watched the brutal, unceremonious eviction unfold. The illusion of Jalen's massive tech wealth was carried away in unmarked moving trucks. The house that was supposed to symbolize their ultimate societal triumph was permanently repossessed, leaving behind nothing but an empty, echoing shell. Across the city, the exact same wave of institutional retribution crashed violently over Megan's personal vanity project. Her high-end fashion boutique sat in the center of the most exclusive commercial district. She had utilized the store as a physical monument to her elite status, completely ignoring the catastrophic operating debts accumulating in the background. At noon, the property managers from Apex Holdings arrived at the storefront, accompanied by local law enforcement officers. Megan had leveraged her husband's fraudulent capital to maintain the illusion of profitability, purposefully ignoring the massive commercial rent arrears piling up month after month. Apex Holdings executed their landlord lien with zero hesitation. Heavy steel chains were immediately woven through the sleek, gilded handles of the boutique's glass doors. Massive brass padlocks snapped shut permanently, barring entry to the premises. A stark, legally binding seizure notice was taped over the elegant storefront logo. A specialized commercial liquidation team bypassed the locked front entrance through the rear loading dock. They brought thick cardboard boxes and heavy plastic bins. They ruthlessly stripped the boutique of its entire inventory. They seized the rows of imported silk dresses. They confiscated the glass display cases filled with designer handbags. They packed away the expensive custom jewelry that Megan had flaunted to her wealthy friends. Every single physical item within those four walls was legally confiscated to slowly chip away at the massive financial crater she had dug for herself. The beautiful, fragrant sanctuary she had used to mock my simple lifestyle was entirely dismantled within 2 hours. The luxurious space was transformed into a barren, dark, and locked commercial vacancy. Her glamorous identity was boxed up and hauled off to a discount liquidation warehouse to be sold for pennies on the dollar. The absolute destruction of Jalen's professional identity occurred simultaneously inside the sleek, glass-walled skyscraper housing his technology startup. The corporate board of directors convened an emergency morning session the second the federal indictment hit the public wire. They voted unanimously to officially and permanently dissolve the entire company. The corporate executives instantly severed all legal and financial ties with their disgraced founder to salvage whatever minimal capital remained. Within minutes of the vote, the bright modern office space descended into total chaos. Over 50 employees were informed that their paychecks would bounce and their contracts were immediately terminated. The workers silently grabbed cardboard boxes and began packing up their desks under the watchful eyes of private corporate security. The servers were unplugged, the proprietary code was locked down, and the glowing neon logos were unscrewed from the lobby walls. Jalen's glorious empire was effectively erased from existence before the lunch hour arrived. The financial bleeding, however, did not stop at corporate dissolution. The elite venture capitalists who had humiliated Jalen at the gala mobilized their army of corporate attorneys. They filed a massive, relentless class-action civil lawsuit against Jalen personally. They bypassed the standard corporate protections, explicitly piercing the corporate veil due to the documented criminal fraud. They sued him for every single dollar he had squandered, explicitly targeting any future earnings he might ever generate. They ensured that even if Jalen miraculously survived federal prison, he would spend the absolute rest of his natural life crushed beneath an insurmountable mountain of aggressive civil debt. His name was entirely blacklisted across the entire technological sector. The brilliant, untouchable software visionary was permanently reduced to a toxic, radioactive liability that no legitimate business would ever touch again. I drove my refurbished truck to the massive commercial development site on the edge of the city. I parked across the street and watched the final phase of the cleansing unfold with absolute unshakable calm. I did not step out of the vehicle. I simply watched the consequences of betrayal manifest in real time. Bradley Thorne's heavy construction equipment was being systematically evicted from the premium job site. Valerie Thorne had moved with the precise, lethal efficiency she was known for in the industrial sector. She had filed the emergency corporate injunctions overnight. She successfully and entirely purged Bradley's name from the company registry, erasing his executive authority with a single stroke of a judge's pen. Bradley was officially a trespasser on the site he had commanded just a week earlier. A fleet of massive flatbed trucks operated by a rival contracting firm Valerie had instantly hired rolled onto the dirt lot. They began towing away the excavators, the bulldozers and the heavy cranes bearing the old Thorn Construction logos. Bradley's corrupt foremen were handed immediate termination notices and ordered off the property by armed site security. The toxic network Bradley had utilized to siphon funds and execute his illicit affairs was completely dismantled in the harsh light of day. I watched the last truck carry away the remnants of his stolen authority. The slate was finally brutally wiped clean. The people who had conspired to steal my home drug, my mind, and destroy my legacy were stripped of their homes, their businesses, and their freedom. I turned the ignition key, feeling the steady, reliable rumble of the engine. I drove away from the empty dirt lot, leaving the wreckage of their immense greed entirely in the rearview mirror. 6 months later, the sterile wood-paneled walls of the federal courthouse offered zero refuge from the absolute reality of their crimes. I sat in the front row of the gallery and watched Jalen and Megan take their seats at the heavy defense table. The physical transformation they had undergone was staggering. The polished, untouchable tech visionary and the glamorous high-society boutique owner had been entirely erased by half a year of relentless stress asset seizure and the crushing weight of federal indictments. Jalen wore an ill-fitting, discounted gray suit that hung loosely off his gaunt, exhausted frame. His posture, once defined by arrogant corporate dominance, was now permanently slumped in defeat. Megan sat beside him, her face devoid of expensive makeup, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. She looked utterly drained, stripped of her emerald gowns and diamond accessories. They sat inches apart but completely isolated from one another. Two bitter enemies chained together by a mutual criminal defense. The federal prosecutor stood before the jury box and methodically laid out the undeniable timeline of the wire fraud, the forged power of attorney, and the conspiracy to commit elder abuse. He did not rely on emotional appeals. He relied entirely on the digital footprints, the seized bank records, and the audio files Jonathan had surrendered to the Bureau. Jalen flinched every time his own recorded voice echoed through the courtroom speakers, explicitly detailing his plans to bypass banking protocols. The jury watched them with absolute clinical detachment. Jalen and Megan had built their entire marriage on the superficial illusion of success, and now they were forced to sit in utter silence as the federal government meticulously dissected every single lie they had ever told. Jalen's high-priced defense attorney approached the witness stand with the calculated predatory stride of a man accustomed to dismantling vulnerable targets. He was a ruthless litigator who specialized entirely in elder fraud cases, famously securing acquittals by aggressively painting senior victims as cognitively impaired, confused, or wildly vindictive. He stood directly in front of me, adjusting his designer glasses, and immediately launched a highly aggressive cross-examination. He did not attempt to deny that the loan documents were altered. Instead, he attempted to completely shift the narrative, framing my actions as a malicious, premeditated setup orchestrated by a jealous, spiteful father. He raised his voice, demanding to know if I had deliberately warped my signature on the power of attorney specifically to entrap my own flesh and blood. He accused me of harboring deep resentment toward Jalen's modern success, suggesting I manufactured the entire banking crisis to destroy his tech startup out of pure malice. He paced aggressively in front of the jury box, throwing out rapid-fire accusations designed to fluster and confuse me. He implied that an elderly man living alone in the mountains was naturally prone to paranoia and cognitive decline. He painted a picture of a tragic family misunderstanding, arguing that Jalen was merely trying to modernize my estate, while I ruthlessly weaponized the federal banking system to punish him for a simple administrative oversight. He leaned over the wooden railing of the witness box, raising his voice to a theatrical crescendo, demanding that I look the jury in the eye and admit I wanted to destroy my son out of petty vengeance. I did not shrink away from the aggressive attorney. I did not raise my voice, nor did I display a single ounce of the confusion or vindictive anger he so desperately needed the jury to see. I leaned forward into the microphone and answered every single one of his accusations with lethal, undeniable precision. I looked directly at the jury and provided the exact dates, times, and secure banking routing numbers associated with every unauthorized attempt Jalen made to access my accounts. I recited the specific IP addresses logged by my financial institution, matching them flawlessly to the servers at Jalen's tech startup. I systematically dismantled the lawyer's narrative of cognitive decline by demonstrating absolute razor-sharp mastery over my own financial empire. I calmly explained that I did not forge my own signature or commit any administrative crime. I simply omitted my middle initial and altered the final stroke of my last name, a perfectly legal action that automatically triggered a standard fraud alert within my personal wealth management protocol. I stated clearly that I did not create a malicious trap. I merely established a passive security boundary. I looked the defense attorney dead in the eye and told the entire courtroom that I did not force Jalen to forge a power of attorney. I did not force Jalen to bribe a bank manager to ignore the fraud alert. I did not force Megan to wire $50,000 into a dummy account. I simply stepped aside and allowed their own monumental greed to activate the security measures. The defense attorney's shoulders slumped, his aggressive posture evaporating instantly. He had no follow-up questions because there is absolutely no legal defense against a witness who weaponizes the cold, unfeeling truth. The final devastating blow to Jalen's defense arrived the following morning. The heavy courtroom doors opened and federal marshals escorted Dr. Eris Thorne to the witness stand. The disgraced psychiatrist wore a standard-issue orange inmate jumpsuit, his hands shackled firmly at his waist. He looked utterly broken, stripped of his medical license and his arrogant professional superiority. The federal prosecutor had offered Dr. Thorne a heavily reduced sentence in exchange for his full, unedited cooperation, and the corrupt doctor eagerly accepted the plea deal to save himself. Dr. Thorne sat in the witness box and systematically detailed the exact mechanics of the fake dementia plot. He testified under oath that Jalen had approached him with a premeditated conspiracy to forcefully incarcerate me. He confirmed with clinical detachment that Jalen paid him a $20,000 cash bribe to falsify a medical diagnosis and sign a state-mandated psychiatric hold. He told the horrified jury that Jalen specifically requested a diagnosis of advanced irreversible cognitive decline to guarantee immediate uncontested control over my entire mountain estate. The jury physically recoiled, staring at Jalen with absolute unmasked disgust. The reality of the plot was no longer an accusation. It was documented sworn testimony from the medical professional hired to execute it. Jalen buried his face in his hands, completely unable to look at the jury, the judge, or me. Megan stared at the table, silently weeping as the inescapable weight of federal prison settled permanently onto her shoulders. The truth of their monstrous greed had been laid completely bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The gavel fell, closing the arguments and effectively sealing their fate permanently. The federal jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Such a rapid return in a complex financial fraud and elder abuse trial signaled absolute certainty. The 12 men and women filed back into the sterile courtroom, their faces completely devoid of sympathy. I sat in the front row of the gallery, maintaining a rigid, upright posture as the foreperson handed the sealed envelope to the bailiff. The heavy silence in the room pressed down on Jalen and Megan like a physical weight. Jalen gripped the edge of the mahogany defense table, his knuckles bone-white, desperately searching the jurors' eyes for a single shred of doubt. He found none. The federal judge adjusted his reading glasses and opened the document. He did not drag out the moment. He read the verdicts with cold, mechanical efficiency. On the counts of felony wire fraud, grand bank fraud, and forgery of a federal banking document, the jury found Jalen guilty. On the counts of conspiracy to commit elder abuse and medical fraud, the jury found Jalen guilty. The judge turned the page and continued without pausing for the shocked gasps from the remaining gallery. On the counts of grand larceny and identity theft, the jury found Megan guilty. Jalen physically collapsed into his chair, the remaining breath rushing out of his lungs. Megan buried her face in her trembling hands, quietly sobbing as the absolute reality of her ruined life finally set in. They had walked into the federal courthouse clinging to a delusional hope that their high-priced lawyers could manipulate the truth. The rapid, unanimous guilty verdicts completely eradicated that delusion. The trap they had built for me had officially and permanently closed around them. The judge set the verdict sheets down and ordered Jalen to stand. My son rose on shaking legs, completely stripped of the arrogant corporate armor he had worn for the past decade. The judge looked down from the bench with an expression of profound, unfiltered disgust. He noted for the official record that the federal judiciary system observes a strict zero-leniency policy for premeditated elder financial abuse executed by immediate family members. He stated that taking advantage of a parent's trust is a common cowardly crime, but Jalen's specific methodology elevated his actions to a level of extraordinary malice. The judge condemned the sheer cruelty of attempting to lock a perfectly sane, independent father inside a state-mandated psychiatric facility purely for financial gain. He highlighted the audio recordings provided by my investigator, pointing out the chilling, remorseless laughter Jalen and Megan shared, while plotting to strip away my fundamental human rights. The judge methodically dismantled Jalen's character, stating that he had weaponized the medical system to commit a profound moral atrocity. He declared that bribing a corrupt psychiatrist to manufacture a false dementia diagnosis was not a simple business transgression. It was an act of psychological violence designed to erase my autonomy and steal the cabin I built with my own hands. The judge made it completely clear that Jalen did not view his father as a human being, but merely as a disposable asset, blocking his path to unearned wealth. Jalen kept his eyes glued to the floor, entirely incapable of meeting the judge's searing gaze. The courtroom hung on every brutal word as the magistrate systematically destroyed the last remaining fragment of Jalen's dignity. The judge did not allow the heavy silence to linger before bringing the hammer down. He officially moved to the sentencing phase, ensuring the consequences of their immense greed became permanent, irreversible realities. He addressed Jalen first, matching the severity of the crimes with the full weight of the federal sentencing guidelines. The judge sentenced my son to 8 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary. Jalen let out a sharp, choked gasp, his knees buckling slightly as the massive span of time hit his conscious mind. He would lose his youth, his career, and his freedom in a single stroke. The judge immediately turned his attention to Megan. He completely dismissed her attorney's desperate plea for probation based on marital coercion. He noted her active, willing participation in the wire fraud and the theft of my retirement funds. The judge sentenced Megan to 4 years in federal prison, permanently shattering her glamorous high society existence. She wept openly, the sound echoing harshly against the wood-paneled walls. The scope of the justice delivered extended beyond my immediate family. The judge read the concurrent sentencing for Bradley Thorne, who had accepted a separate plea agreement earlier that week. For his role in accepting stolen federal funds and executing systemic corporate embezzlement against Thorne Construction, Bradley received a mandatory 3-year federal prison sentence. The entire network of betrayal had been systematically uprooted and penalized. The judge struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack. The sharp sound signaled the absolute end of the proceedings. The federal government had reclaimed the stolen capital, dismantled the fraudulent tech startup, and condemned the conspirators to cages of steel and concrete. 2 armed federal bailiffs immediately stepped forward to take physical custody of the prisoners. They instructed Jalen and Megan to place their hands behind their backs. The metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom, finalizing the transition from citizens to federal inmates. As the bailiffs grabbed Jalen by the biceps and forcefully turned him toward the side, holding cell, my son stopped fighting the restraints. He dragged his feet against the polished floor and twisted his neck, desperately searching the front row of the gallery. His bloodshot, terrified eyes locked directly onto mine. He looked at me with the fractured, pleading expression of a child begging for a reprieve that he fundamentally knew was impossible. He desperately wanted a final nod of forgiveness, a reassuring glance, or any minuscule sign that his father still harbored some lingering fraction of paternal love. I remained seated with my hands resting calmly on my lap. I kept my posture perfectly rigid and my expression entirely blank. I did not offer him a comforting nod. I did not mouth a silent promise of future reconciliation. I looked at the man who had gladly traded my freedom for a commercial loan with eyes as hard and unyielding as granite. I simply sat in the quiet courtroom and watched the absolute, unavoidable consequence of his own treacherous actions unfold. The bailiff shoved Jalen forward, breaking our line of sight permanently. The heavy wooden door of the holding cell slammed shut behind him with a resonant, echoing boom. The debt was fully collected. The engineered crisis was completely resolved. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked steadily out of the federal courthouse and into the bright morning sun. 1 year later, the harsh, biting wind of the Blue Ridge Mountains whipped across the newly reinforced timber of my front porch. The comprehensive winterization was finally complete. The heavy insulated storm windows completely sealed out the freezing drafts, and the reinforced structural supports anchored the cabin firmly against the frozen, unforgiving earth. I stood near the heavy wooden railing and breathed in the sharp, crystalline mountain air. It was remarkably clean. It carried absolutely no trace of the toxic, suffocating smog of the city or the suffocating stench of high society greed. I had originally built this isolated retreat with my own calloused hands precisely to escape that exact poison. I designed this sanctuary to be a place of quiet reflection, a physical barrier against the relentless consuming ambition that inevitably corrupts weak men. Jalen and Megan had looked at these solid oak walls and seen nothing but raw equity to exploit. They had looked at my sanctuary and seen a temporary stepping stone to fund their pathetic manufactured empire. They failed to understand that timber and stone do not yield to fraudulent paperwork. The mountain does not negotiate with thieves. I ran my hand along the smooth, polished grain of the porch railing. The wood was cold, but it was solid. It was entirely mine. The long, grueling months of federal trials, asset liquidation, and relentless legal depositions were officially behind me. The slate was completely wiped clean. The sprawling city miles below me continued to hum with desperate people chasing empty wealth, but that frantic noise could no longer reach me here. I had successfully defended the borders of my existence. I stood alone in the biting cold, feeling the profound, undeniable satisfaction of a man who had weathered a catastrophic storm and emerged completely intact. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over frozen gravel broke the pristine morning silence. A sleek black luxury SUV navigated the steep winding mountain driveway with practiced precision and shifted into park near the freshly chopped woodpile. The heavy driver's side door swung open, and Valerie Thorne stepped out onto the frozen earth. She wore a thick tailored wool coat against the biting wind, her sharp features framed by a dark scarf. She did not bring a briefcase filled with corporate injunctions or termination notices. She carried a single heavy glass bottle of aged Kentucky bourbon. We were no longer allied conspirators executing a mutual ruthless takedown of our deceitful spouses. We were simply two hardened survivors, sharing the unique, unspoken bond of profound betrayal. I walked down the wooden steps and met her halfway across the frosted driveway. We did not exchange hollow pleasantries or fake smiles. Valerie handed me the heavy bottle, its amber liquid catching the pale winter sunlight. I led her up to the reinforced porch where two heavy Adirondack rocking chairs sat facing the sweeping, endless valley. I retrieved two heavy crystal glasses from the kitchen, poured the dark liquor, and handed her a glass. We sat in the freezing mountain air and drank the bourbon in complete, comfortable silence. The burn of the alcohol perfectly matched the biting cold of the wind. Valerie looked out over the jagged, snow-capped peaks, her posture remarkably relaxed for a woman who managed a multi-million-dollar industrial empire. The suffocating weight of Bradley's parasitic existence was entirely gone from her shoulders. She had successfully excised the infection from her company and her life. We raised our glasses in a silent mutual toast. We drank to the absolute destruction of our enemies and the ruthless preservation of our own peace. I set my empty crystal glass on the small wooden table next to my chair and retrieved a thick, heavily bound leather folder from inside the cabin. I sat back down and opened the folder across my lap. The crisp white pages contained the finalized, legally binding documents of my newly restructured estate trust. The federal courts had efficiently returned every single dollar Megan had siphoned from my retirement accounts, and Jonathan Hayes had aggressively blocked the bank's attempt to seize the cabin equity. My financial empire was entirely restored, but its ultimate destination was permanently altered. I had explicitly and irrevocably stripped Jalen's name from every single page. He would never inherit a single penny of the wealth I had built. He would never step foot on this mountain property again. Instead, the documents directed the entirety of my liquid assets, corporate holdings, and real estate portfolio into a massive, heavily fortified scholarship fund. The trust was legally mandated to provide full-ride tuition for minority engineering students who demonstrated profound financial need and exceptional academic grit. I was dedicating my life's work to young, hungry builders who actually understood the value of hard work, discipline, and integrity. I was giving my legacy to strangers who would utilize the capital to build actual futures, rather than squandering it on designer suits and fraudulent startups. I took a heavy fountain pen from my coat pocket and signed my full correct legal signature on the final line of the binding contract. I pressed the pen firmly against the thick paper, ensuring the ink bled deep into the fibers. There would be no forged power of attorney capable of breaking this ironclad trust. My legacy was officially secured, protected by layers of relentless federal oversight and dedicated entirely to the future. Valerie finished the last drop of her bourbon and stood up from the wooden rocking chair. She buttoned her heavy wool coat against the rising mountain wind and offered me a final brief nod of profound respect. She walked back to her black SUV, the heavy tires crunching rhythmically against the frozen gravel as she reversed out of the driveway and slowly descended the winding mountain road. I watched her taillights disappear around the final bend of the tree line. I was entirely alone again. I sat back in the heavy wooden rocking chair and looked out over the vast, uninterrupted expanse of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The winter sun hung low in the gray sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the frozen valley floor. The silence that settled over the cabin was absolute. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a father willfully ignoring the bitter truth about his only son. It was no longer the tense, expectant silence of a man waiting for a meticulously planned trap to spring shut. It was the pure, unadulterated silence of absolute control. I listened to the steady, rhythmic creak of the wooden rockers against the solid porch floorboards. I listened to the wind howling fiercely through the barren branches of the ancient oaks. I had survived the ultimate betrayal by the people I trusted most. I had successfully drawn the poison out of my life, neutralizing the imminent threat with lethal, uncompromising precision. The massive, chaotic storm they had brought to my doorstep had been entirely crushed. The traitors were locked away in federal prison cells, stripped of their stolen wealth and their fraudulent identities. The adjustment was officially complete. I closed my eyes, breathed in the freezing mountain air, and finally allowed myself to rest. True strength does not lie in blind loyalty to those who share your blood, but in the fierce protection of your own dignity. When family members weaponize your love for their financial gain, cutting them off is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of survival. Wealth and legacy should empower the honorable, not feed the entitled. Sometimes the most profound peace is found only after the hardest battles are fought and the deepest betrayals are severed. Your primary responsibility is to guard your own peace, ensuring that your work serves a genuinely positive, lasting, meaningful purpose. If you found value in Darren's journey of reclaiming his power, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts on setting boundaries with toxic family members. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience.